America's history is full of legends, battles, and presidents, but buried beneath the monuments and marble lies a weirder truth. A president with 15 kids. A CIA plan to weaponize cats. A war over cows. This isn't the history class you slept through. This is 111 jaw-dropping, ridiculous, completely real moments that actually happened in the United States. So buckle up, because once you fall down this rabbit hole of absurdity, there's no climbing back out without a goat, a pigeon, and possibly a whiskey ration. Welcome to 111 Ridiculous U.S. History Facts. Benjamin Franklin's kite-powered swim. Benjamin Franklin was a man of many things: inventor, diplomat, philosopher, lover of French women. But few know he was also a self-taught swimmer who believed the solution to crossing a pond efficiently was to hitch himself to a kite. That's right. In the 18th century, long before lifeguards, Franklin decided to turn a calm pond into a makeshift airstrip for his aquatic ambitions. He climbed into the water, gripped a homemade kite string, and let the wind yank him across like a colonial water skier. It worked. Sort of. This is the kind of absurd confidence that could only come from a man who once electrocuted himself in the name of science and still thought, "More of that, please." For Franklin, the line between genius and eccentric was basically optional. He wanted to prove that wind power wasn't just for sailing, it was for soaking, too. A man swimming via kite might not be the most graceful scene in American history, but it's one of the most Benjamin Franklin things ever done. And speaking of things getting out of hand in rural waters, let's talk about the time Vermont went to war over cows and cream, the Great Vermont Cow War of 1913. In 1913, Vermont dairy farmers lost their minds. Not metaphorically. Full-on pitchforks in the street lost it. When milk prices dropped to rock bottom, farmers saw red and white. They began dumping entire shipments of milk into ditches, creeks, and even the streets. Protesters stormed dairies and blocked trucks. Milk became both the weapon and the battlefield. Welcome to the Great Vermont Cow War. The war wasn't a shootout, but it was a full-on economic insurgency. Farmers were tired of middlemen profiting while they barely scraped by. Milk was perishable, volatile, and now political. They formed co-ops, held rallies, and threatened violence to anyone who tried to undercut them. For a brief moment, Vermont looked less like a postcard and more like a scene from a lactose-fueled revolution. Newspapers couldn't get enough. "The farmers are revolting," one headline read, accurate on all fronts. Eventually, the chaos forced legislative hearings and reforms in milk pricing, but not before Vermont cemented its place as the only U.S. state to ever fight a non-lethal war over dairy. Which brings us to another uniquely excessive American. A president who didn't just break records, he bred them. Let's talk about John Tyler, the nation's original dad joke incarnate. John Tyler had 15 children. John Tyler, 10th President of the United States, accidental commander-in-chief, and the father of 15 children. That's not a typo. 15. He had 8 kids with his first wife, who tragically passed away, and then turned around and had 7 more with his second, who was 30 years younger. If John Tyler were alive today, he'd be dodging paternity tests on daytime TV. Tyler wasn't just prolific, he was determined. He was 63 when his last child was born. 63? That's older than Social Security eligibility, and he was still out there setting nursery records. His children spanned multiple generations. Some were born when Thomas Jefferson was still alive, and 2 of his grandchildren were still alive in the 21st century. Wrap your head around that generational math. The man was a walking genealogical paradox. What's more, this wasn't just reproductive enthusiasm. Tyler wielded family as political leverage, marrying into wealth, consolidating Southern elite power, and producing a small army of potential heirs. It was dynasty building, 1800 style. And speaking of ambitious foundations, let's head underground. Deep under the Capitol, where a secret crypt was built to house America's first demigod, George Washington. The Capitol's secret tomb for George Washington. Beneath the marble and grandeur of the U.S. Capitol lies something far stranger than congressional gridlock, an underground crypt. Not metaphorical, literal. It was built for one purpose, to house the remains of George Washington, like some Roman emperor of democracy. In the late 18th century, the plan was clear. When Washington died, his body would be moved from Mount Vernon and placed beneath the rotunda, where light from above would dramatically spill down onto his sarcophagus. Eternal reverence meets architectural overkill. But there was a catch. Washington himself. The man had left specific instructions in his will that he was to be buried at Mount Vernon. And Martha wasn't exactly eager to part with her husband's corpse, just to complete a mood-lit tourist attraction. The government tried negotiating with the family twice, but each time was met with a polite but firm absolutely not. So the tomb was built. The space was carved out. A crypt with no corpse. It's still down there today, empty, echoing, and oddly poetic. Washington remains in Virginia, and the Capitol has a ghost chamber under its feet. Now imagine that crypt during Prohibition, because the next absurd chapter involves booze, loopholes, and very concerned doctors. Prohibition's prescription for whiskey. The year is 1921. You're sick. You go to the doctor and say you've got the nerves, or maybe a rattling cough. Your doctor leans in, scribbles on a pad, and hands you a miracle cure. 1 pint of whiskey, every 10 days. Welcome to Prohibition, where medicine suddenly tasted suspiciously like bourbon. When the 18th Amendment outlawed alcohol, Americans didn't stop drinking. They just got creative. And nothing says creativity like transforming liquor into a prescription drug. Physicians across the country wrote millions of whiskey prescriptions for medicinal use, treating everything from anxiety to digestion issues to living during Prohibition. Pharmacists became unofficial bartenders. Some even decorated their drugstores with oak bars and served up shots between aspirin orders. The government tried to crack down, but the loophole was legal and booming. Doctors made bank, patients stayed buzzed, and America got a lesson in how absurd morality laws can become when they collide with ingenuity and thirst. And if you think a prescription whiskey racket is bizarre, just wait till we talk about a French statue, Egyptian peasants, and a woman who was almost the face of liberty itself. The Statue of Liberty's original design was Egyptian. Before she stood tall in New York Harbor, Lady Liberty had a much different identity and a drastically different job. Her original design was not as a beacon for immigrants, but as an Egyptian peasant woman holding a torch over the Suez Canal. Sculptor Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi envisioned her as a colossal figure symbolizing industrial progress at the mouth of Africa's most crucial trade artery. Draped in traditional robes, she would have stood watch as ships sailed between continents, bearing the torch not of liberty, but of economic modernity. The project never materialized. Too expensive, too complicated, and frankly, too French. So Bartholdi repurposed the idea, changed the peasant into a Greco-Roman goddess, traded Egypt for America, and rebranded the torch as the light of freedom. Voila, icon born. But the roots remain strange. Our beloved statue was almost not American. She was almost a brown-robed figure guarding the Suez in the name of Enlightenment age globalization. The symbolism is poetic. The journey? Completely bonkers. And speaking of dramatic reinventions, let's look at a president who carried lead in his chest and still managed to outshoot his enemies. The human powder keg that was Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson took a bullet, then took a life. Andrew Jackson was not a man you wanted to cross. He didn't just talk tough. He lived it, bled it, and literally carried it in his body. In 1806, long before his presidency, Jackson participated in one of the most brutal duels in American history. The target? Charles Dickinson, a man who had publicly insulted Jackson's wife. In the world of early American honor culture, that was basically a death sentence. The duel was arranged with all the tense formality of a Shakespearean tragedy. Dickinson was a known sharpshooter. Jackson knew he was outgunned, so he played the long game. He let Dickinson fire first, took the bullet directly in the chest, and then, without flinching, slowly raised his pistol and shot his enemy dead. Not a dramatic final blast. A cold, deliberate kill. The bullet in Jackson's chest was never removed. He carried it with him to the White House. This was the same man who fought in over a dozen duels, once beat an assassin with a cane, and made enemies out of entire financial institutions. Jackson didn't survive the American frontier. He was the frontier. Now, if you think that's intense, wait until you hear about the time the U.S. sent an iceberg diplomat to Denmark. Yes, iceberg. Ambassador. America's iceberg ambassador to Denmark. In 1946, the U.S. government came up with one of its most delightfully bizarre diplomatic missions. Send an iceberg ambassador to Denmark to negotiate the purchase of Greenland. It sounds like the setup to a joke, but it was real. The Cold War had just begun, and Greenland, with its icy vastness and proximity to Europe and the Soviet Union, suddenly looked very valuable. Enter a U.S. envoy, a man tasked not only with traditional diplomacy, but with convincing Denmark to part with a 836,000 square mile glacier. The logic? Strategic air bases, military staging zones, and perhaps a little bit of manifest destiny meets refrigerator logic. Greenland, after all, was the ultimate real estate deal, cold, remote, and geopolitically priceless. The ambassador reportedly carried with him data, weather reports, and maps highlighting all the delightful logistical benefits of owning a giant ice cube. Denmark, unsurprisingly, declined. Greenland stayed Danish. But the moment stands as one of the strangest episodes in post-war American diplomacy. And if you think navigating frozen international politics is weird, just wait until we go back to colonial America, where nobody had clocks and people told time with cannons and bells. Colonial America's noon guns. Before smartphones, before watches, even before reliable clocks, colonial America ran on church bells and boomsticks. In the absence of widespread personal timepieces, many towns kept their schedules with noon guns, cannons that fired once a day to signal the hour. Others relied on church bells rung at key moments, morning prayers, midday meals, marked closings. These weren't just town quirks. They were crucial civic systems. Daily life revolved around collective cues. Farmers, traders, ministers, and magistrates all relied on that boom to mark the pace of life. Some towns even synchronized their bells with the sun, recalibrating periodically based on where the sun hit the horizon. It was timekeeping via explosion and astronomy, a system both chaotic and charming. In larger cities, the practice became ceremonial. The cannon was as much a statement of identity as it was a time teller. It reminded everyone, this is a town that knows what time it is, even if nobody owns a clock. Today, it sounds quaint. Back then, it was essential infrastructure. But speaking of modernity colliding with tradition, the next entry involves the very first U.S. president to be captured not on canvas, but on camera. Say cheese, James K. Polk. James K. Polk's presidential portrait, by camera. Before presidential photos became official PR tools, before awkwardly staged photo ops in the age of high-definition everything, there was James K. Polk, the first sitting U.S. president to ever have his picture taken. It was the 1840s. Daguerreotypes were the bleeding edge of tech. Exposure times were long, faces were stiff, and if you blinked, you blurred into history. But Polk, he posed like a man seizing a legacy. Polk's presidency was known for expansion, Texas, Oregon, California. But this moment was a different kind of frontier. The photograph wasn't meant to flatter. It was cold, hard reality. This wasn't a romanticized oil painting or a bust carved in marble. This was Polk's actual face. Wrinkles, eyes, hairline. Captured forever by a lens that didn't care about artistic license. Americans saw their leader not as an ideal, but as a man. And it changed something. The camera democratized fame. Suddenly, presidents had to live with their real features, just like everyone else. No filters, no flattering angles, just the truth, frozen in silver nitrate. And while Polk was busy being immortalized, the Army was experimenting with something far less photogenic, but much, much more feathery. Get ready for carrier pigeons in combat. The Army's winged cameramen. Long before drones buzzed above war zones, the U.S. Army was looking skyward in a much fluffier direction. Pigeons. During World War I and well into the 20th century, the military experimented with using carrier pigeons to deliver not just messages, but photographic film. Tiny cameras were strapped to their little chests, and these avian scouts were released over enemy territory. The idea? Let the bird do a flyby and snap aerial surveillance images. No human pilot required. It was absurd. It was innovative, and it kind of worked. Pigeons were cheap, hard to hit, and oddly reliable. They didn't ask for pay, didn't leak intel, and returned to their home coops with film rolls dangling like feathered spies. The cameras were crude, timed shutters, no remote controls, but in some cases the images were surprisingly usable. Trees, roads, troop formations, all seen from the world's most unlikely reconnaissance units. The practice didn't last long. Technology moved on, but for a brief window in history, U.S. intelligence had wings. Literal wings. Now trade your vision of sky-spying birds for mud-splattered forests and whispering trees, because our next story takes us into the swamps of the Revolutionary War, where a ghost led the fight. The swamp fox strikes. Francis Marion wasn't a general. He was a shadow, a whisper in the pines, a nightmare for British troops who thought they'd crush the South. Known as the Swamp Fox, Marion led a guerrilla campaign during the Revolutionary War that turned South Carolina's backwoods into his personal battlefield. He didn't march in lines. He didn't wear bright red or blue. He struck fast, vanished faster, and left his enemies guessing. Marion's tactics were revolutionary, literally. He used small, nimble bands of men to ambush British supply lines, attack outposts, and melt back into the wetlands before the enemy could react. No formal battlefields, no rules of engagement. Just grit, swamps, and hit-and-run chaos. He'd cross rivers barefoot, disappear into the reeds, and strike where least expected. His legend grew faster than the redcoats could map his movements. British officers were so frustrated they offered rewards for his capture, but they couldn't catch a ghost. Marion didn't win the war on his own, but he made the British bleed time, money, and morale. And in a war where survival was half the battle, that mattered. And speaking of chaos flowing where it shouldn't, let's crack open a vat of disaster with the Great Boston Beer Flood. The Great Boston Beer Flood, October 17, 1814. The streets of Boston's North End exploded, literally, with beer. At the Moo and Company Brewery, a massive vat holding over 300,000 gallons of fermenting ale ruptured. The force was so great that it shattered other nearby vats in a domino of alcoholic doom. Within seconds, a 15-foot wall of beer surged through the streets, sweeping away everything in its path. Wooden buildings collapsed. Barrels rolled like boulders. And in the chaos, 8 people lost their lives, drowned or crushed, in one of the strangest industrial disasters in American history. It was the kind of catastrophe that sounds like folklore, but it was all too real. The flood destroyed homes, inundated basements, and left survivors reeking of hops and horror. For days, the air reportedly smelled like a tavern on payday. Some opportunistic residents even tried bottling the beer as it flowed through the streets, proving that even tragedy can't dull a good hustle. The incident sparked debates about industrial safety, but the brewery faced no real consequences because it was ruled an act of God. Imagine explaining that to your insurance company. But if you think that's wild, wait until you learn about the time a U.S. president had surgery on a yacht to hide it from the entire nation. Grover Cleveland's secret cancer surgery. In the summer of 1893, Grover Cleveland wasn't just dealing with an economic depression. He was hiding a tumor in his mouth. Diagnosed with oral cancer, the president made a bold decision. Keep it secret. Totally secret. Not even the vice president was informed, because the country, in crisis, couldn't handle the idea of a sick leader. And so, in peak Gilded Age fashion, Cleveland boarded a friend's yacht and sailed off to undergo one of the most dramatic clandestine surgeries in presidential history. The operation took place on the boat, in near silence, as it gently rocked in the East River. Surgeons removed part of Cleveland's upper jaw and 5 teeth, all without leaving a visible scar. To hide the effects, he was later fitted with a rubber prosthetic so he could continue speaking in public without slurring or lisping. The press got suspicious, rumors swirled, but the official story was that Cleveland had simply had 2 bad teeth removed. The truth wasn't revealed until years later, when one of the surgeons finally spilled the beans. And while Cleveland kept his secrets afloat, his successor brought a new kind of transparency to the very name of the nation's most famous address. The White House gets its name. For over a century, the grand pillared mansion at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue went by many names: the President's House, the Executive Mansion, even the Palace on occasion. But it wasn't until 1901 that it got the name we all know today, thanks to Theodore Roosevelt. The man who rode moose, boxed prize fighters, and practically growled the national anthem into being also gave the White House its official, now iconic moniker. It was more than branding. Roosevelt wanted to emphasize simplicity, clarity, and a break from old-world pomp. Executive Mansion sounded too European, too royal. White House sounded American, clean, straightforward, and impossible to confuse. So he had the name printed on his stationery, ordered it used in official documents, and from that point on, the rebranding stuck. Roosevelt, ever the master of image, understood the power of names. The White House wasn't just a building. It was the symbol of democratic strength, and calling it that made it feel more like the people's house than some distant imperial residence. But names and symbols only go so far, because the next American proposal involved blowing up a continent just to build a better canal. Welcome to the atomic ambitions of the Cold War. The nuclear Panama Canal that never was. In the 1960s, the United States had an idea so absurd, so recklessly ambitious, it could only have been born in the thick fog of Cold War bravado. The goal? Dig a new canal through Central America to rival the Panama Canal, only this time using nuclear bombs, lots of them. This plan, part of the Atomic Energy Commission's Project Plowshare, proposed using peaceful nuclear explosions to move Earth on a scale never before imagined. Because why build with bulldozers when you can vaporize mountains? The plan wasn't a cartoon pitch. Scientists drew up blueprints, estimated yields, and even scoped out potential blast sites in Nicaragua and Colombia. They talked about 250 nuclear detonations, just casually, to dig a trench. Test explosions were conducted in Nevada to simulate the effects. The fallout data? Alarming. Public support? Minimal. Environmental impact? Catastrophic. Eventually, reality caught up with theory. The project was shelved, not because it was impossible, but because even the Cold War had its limits. Detonating dozens of nukes to build a waterway turned out to be a hard sell. Go figure. But if you think nuking canals was extreme, wait until we climb the world's highest mountain, with an American twist and a climber who rewrote history. The first American woman on Everest? Sort of. Mount Everest, 1975. At 29,000 feet above sea level, breathing feels like sipping air through a straw. It's a place where even the clouds look exhausted. And that year, a Japanese climber named Junko Tabei became the first woman to reach the summit. But nestled in the footnotes of history is an American chapter, with just enough confusion to stir debate. While Tabei was the first woman to summit Everest, the U.S. was already building its own Everest legacy. Some sources mistakenly cite an American woman as the first, but that claim belongs in the gray zone of mountain myth. The truth, American women did climb Everest, just not first. But that didn't stop them from facing the same brutal, cold, lethal terrain and gendered skepticism. Climbing in an era where women were expected to conquer shopping lists, not summits, they strapped on crampons and made history anyway. Whether they were first or not, their presence on Everest rewrote the rules. American women helped normalize female mountaineers, opening the peaks to those who refused to stay grounded. And while Everest was being conquered, another U.S. leader faced his own speed bump, literally, involving a horse, a capital city, and a very 19th century traffic ticket. Ulysses S. Grant's horsepower problem. Before speeding tickets became the bane of minivans and Mustangs, there was Ulysses S. Grant, Civil War hero, President of the United States, and apparently a chronic violator of Washington D.C. quote, #ETCO speed limits. His vehicle? A horse. His crime? Riding it too fast through the streets of the capital. That's right, in 1872, Grant was stopped by a D.C. police officer and issued what might be the first ever presidential speeding ticket. The officer had warned Grant the day before. But the next morning, the president was back at it, galloping through the city like it was a battlefield. The officer had no choice. He pulled Grant over, yes, on horseback, and after a brief and oddly respectful exchange, issued him a fine. Grant paid it without protest. This wasn't just a footnote in traffic enforcement history. It was a glimpse into Grant's personality. The man who led Union forces to victory was also, apparently, a bit of a thrill seeker. He loved speed, horses, and the rush of open roads, even if those roads were cobblestone and lined with startled pedestrians. And while Grant galloped through the city, nature was preparing something much more violent. A hurricane that would change the coastline forever. The Great New England Hurricane of 1938. On September 21st, 1938, the East Coast met fury. The Great New England Hurricane struck with almost no warning, leveling towns, smashing coastlines, and reshaping geography. It was a Category 5 monster when it formed, and still a Category 3 when it made landfall. At a time before advanced meteorology or satellite tracking, people had no idea what was coming. They went to work. Children went to school. And then the ocean came to meet them. Winds reached 186 miles per hour. Storm surges swept entire homes off their foundations. Trees were uprooted like weeds. The hurricane created a brand new inlet on Long Island, splitting the land like a surgeon's scalpel. In Connecticut and Rhode Island, it was worse. Downtowns drowned, farms were obliterated, and entire forests were flattened. More than 600 people died. Over 57,000 homes were damaged or destroyed. The storm didn't just devastate, it redefined the landscape. Flood maps had to be redrawn. River paths shifted. Generations later, the marks of the 1938 hurricane can still be found carved into the coastline. And while nature was flexing its power, the U.S. military was flexing something far stranger. Camels, saddlebags, and an experimental course straight out of a desert fever dream. The Camel Corps of the American Southwest. In the blistering 1850s heat of the American Southwest, the U.S. Army had a problem. Mules were dying, wagons were bogged down, and desert crossings were hell. The solution? Import camels. Lots of them. Thus was born the U.S. Camel Corps, an official government-funded military experiment involving 75 dromedaries, a handful of confused handlers, and a hope that camels would thrive where horses failed. At first, it actually worked. Camels carried double the loads of mules. They needed less water. They laughed at sandstorms. Soldiers, however, weren't laughing. The camels were smelly, temperamental, and loud. They terrified the horses, spit at their riders, and refused to follow orders unless bribed with dates and patience. Congress initially saw a promise. Expeditions were launched. Reports came back glowing. But then the Civil War happened, and everything changed. The Camel Corps was abandoned. The animals were auctioned off or left to wander. Some were spotted in the wild decades later, lone ghosts of a failed military dream. But just as the Army was learning to wrangle beasts of burden, another president was learning to wrangle journalists by stepping up to the mic and facing the press head-on. Woodrow Wilson's press conferences. Before spin rooms and sound bites, before daily White House briefings became cable news fodder, there was Woodrow Wilson, the first president to hold regularly scheduled press conferences. It was 1913. The media landscape was growing fast. Wilson, a former academic and orator, understood the power of narrative. So he opened the doors of the White House, cautiously, to the press. But this wasn't a free-for-all. Wilson's conferences were informal, often off the record, and strictly monitored. Reporters couldn't quote him directly unless he gave permission. Even so, it was revolutionary. For the first time, journalists could ask the president real questions and watch his responses in real time. No intermediaries, no filtered statements, just the president and the press in a room, staring each other down. It was a gamble. But Wilson believed in transparency, at least the curated kind. And while he didn't always love the scrutiny, he paved the way for a more engaged, more visible presidency. Still, his moment in the spotlight was nothing compared to the lightning-fast rise and fall of America's fastest mail service, a legendary ride that galloped straight into obsolescence. The Pony Express is next. The Pony Express gallops into history. It was bold. It was fast. It was doomed. The Pony Express, launched in 1860, was the most legendary short-lived mail service in American history. Built to connect Missouri to California in just 10 days, the operation was a relay race of horsemen thundering across nearly 2,000 miles of wild terrain. Rain, snow, deserts, bandits, nothing was supposed to stop them. The riders, many of them teenagers, would cover 75, 100 miles per shift, swapping horses every 10-15 miles at remote stations. They carried mail in a special saddlebag called a mochila, switching it between horses like a hot potato. It was romanticized immediately. The brave courier racing through the frontier became a symbol of American grit and determination. But beneath the heroism was a financial disaster. The service hemorrhaged money. Then came the telegraph. In October 1861, just 18 months after its launch, the Pony Express was obsolete. Still, its legend galloped ahead. It proved the West could be connected, even if just for a fleeting, glorious moment. And while America was looking skyward with wires and poles, the military began glancing even higher, toward UFOs, flying saucers, and one very classified file cabinet known as Project Blue Book. Project Blue Book and America's UFO obsession. In the middle of the Cold War, the U.S. military had a problem. People kept seeing things in the sky, glowing orbs, flying saucers, metallic discs zipping around like cosmic frisbees. Was it Soviet tech? Was it aliens? Was it mass hysteria? In 1952, the U.S. Air Force decided to find out, or at least look like it was. Thus began Project Blue Book, the official government program to study unidentified flying objects. Based at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, Project Blue Book investigated over 12,000 sightings between 1952 and 1969. Most were explained: weather balloons, misidentified aircraft, astronomical phenomena, but about 700 remained unidentified. The files grew thick with reports, sketches, radar data, and interviews with everyone from military pilots to random farmers who swore the sky blinked at them. The project wasn't about proving aliens. It was about maintaining public trust and national security. But in trying to shut down speculation, it actually fueled it. The secrecy, the vague conclusions, the classified documents, it all stoked the UFO fire into a cultural obsession. And while officials were busy chasing lights in the sky, Andrew Jackson's funeral took a hilariously dark turn, thanks to a foul-mouthed parrot that stole the show. Andrew Jackson's swearing parrot. You can measure a man by the company he keeps, or in Andrew Jackson's case, by the pet that crashed his funeral. When the fiery 7th president passed away in 1845, mourners gathered at his plantation, the Hermitage, for a somber and respectable service. But then his parrot opened its beak. The bird, named Paul, had picked up Jackson's colorful vocabulary, every crude, vile, unprintable word you can imagine. And it didn't just whisper them, it squawked them, loudly, repeatedly. According to first-hand accounts, the parrot began cursing so violently that it had to be removed from the ceremony. Guests were reportedly horrified. Some even fled. The event turned from eulogy to expletive showcase, courtesy of an avian with zero chill. The story sounds like myth, but it fits Jackson perfectly. The man was a brawler, a duelist, a political flamethrower. Of course, his parrot would have a vocabulary fit for a sailor with road rage. It was the perfect, unintentional tribute. Wild, uncontrollable, and utterly unforgettable. And from foul-mouthed birds, we glide into glow-in-the-dark absurdity. Because next up is the U.S. postage stamp that actually lit up the night. The glowing postage stamp. Some things just don't need to glow. Your mail is one of them. But in 1997, the United States Postal Service disagreed. That year, to celebrate the wonders of astronomy, they released a series of stamps featuring celestial bodies, and one in particular that literally glowed in the dark. That's right, a glowing postage stamp, for reasons both scientific and whimsically excessive. The stamp featured an image of Earth's moon. By day, it looked normal enough, but turn off the lights and the moon lit up in green phosphorescent ink. It was a novelty, sure, but it also marked a tiny technological milestone in printing. It used special ink, precise layering, and sparked buzz among collectors and casual mailers alike. It didn't serve a practical purpose, unless you were sending letters in a blackout. But it showed how even the postal system could get a little weirdly artistic. The glowing moon stamp was a hit, especially with kids and stamp nerds. It proved that even in the age of fax machines and growing email use, stamps could still surprise you. Sometimes, literally in the dark. And speaking of strong federal statements, let's rewind to the first big rebellion America faced after writing the Constitution. Whiskey, torches, and tax fury. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. Taxation without representation may have started the American Revolution. But taxation with representation didn't go down much smoother. In 1791, the newly formed federal government decided to impose a tax on distilled spirits to help pay off war debts. Frontier farmers, many of whom turned their grain into whiskey for easy transport and trade, were furious. They didn't see a tax. They saw tyranny. By 1794, Western Pennsylvania had erupted in full-blown revolt. Armed protesters burned tax collectors' homes, tarred and feathered officials, and organized under banners that echoed revolutionary slogans. It wasn't just a protest, it was a stress test for the Constitution itself. Could the federal government enforce its laws? Would rebellion be tolerated? President George Washington, now in civilian command, said no. He personally led a militia force of nearly 13,000 men into the region, a staggering display of power. The rebellion collapsed with barely a skirmish. It was over, but the message was clear. The Constitution had teeth. And while Washington showed up with troops, another president would later show up with robes and judicial power. Meet the man who ruled both the Oval Office and the Supreme Court bench, William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft, President and Chief Justice. William Howard Taft had a resume so stacked it looked fictional. He didn't just serve as President of the United States, he also became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, making him the only person in American history to head both branches of government. It wasn't a fluke, it was his dream job. Taft famously never wanted to be president. He wanted to wear robes, not run campaigns. After his one-term presidency ended in 1913, Taft went back to teaching law and quietly lobbied for a judicial appointment. In 1921, his dream came true. President Harding appointed him Chief Justice, and Taft finally stepped into the role he believed was his true calling. And he excelled. He streamlined court procedures, reduced backlogs, and left a lasting legacy as an efficient, conservative force on the bench. Taft was no mere figurehead. He reshaped the judiciary with the same weight he once carried through the White House, though ironically, he often said he was happier as Chief Justice than he'd ever been as president. And while Taft ruled the court, Another branch of the military was out in the ocean, recruiting SEALs. No, not the Navy SEALs. Actual trained aquatic animals, the Navy's SEAL Scouts. Long before sonar drones and underwater robots, the U.S. Navy toyed with an idea straight out of a Saturday morning cartoon. Trained SEALs that could sniff out underwater mines. Not human Navy SEALs, actual flippered, whiskered, fish-loving sea mammals. These highly intelligent creatures were recruited during the Cold War era for their natural abilities, keen hearing, superb underwater vision, and a built-in sonar system that put the finest tech to shame. The program, shrouded in Cold War secrecy, was part of a broader military trend of using animals for specialized tasks. Dolphins were the stars, but SEALs had their moment too. They were trained to carry small devices, identify suspicious objects, and even tag mines or retrieve items from the ocean floor. In theory, these aquatic operatives could help clear naval paths without putting human divers at risk. Of course, it wasn't perfect. SEALs are clever, but also stubborn. They occasionally wandered off, got distracted, or refused to follow commands. And the ethical implications of using wild animals for military ops eventually caught up with the program. But back before all this underwater intrigue, there was a different kind of mysticism catching fire on land. Ghost dances, spiritual awakenings, and a movement that ended in tragedy. The ghost dance and Wounded Knee. In the late 19th century, amid relentless land grabs, forced relocations, and cultural suppression, Native American tribes across the West were desperate for hope. That hope came in the forms of the ghost dance, a spiritual movement that promised renewal, redemption, and resistance. Followers believed that by performing the dance, the spirits of their ancestors would return, the buffalo would roam again, and the white oppressors would vanish. It was part religion, part protest, and all desperation. It spread like wildfire, especially among the Lakota Sioux. But the U.S. government, already jittery from decades of frontier conflict, saw it as a call to war. Tensions flared. Misinformation flowed. The situation escalated until December 29, 1890, when the U.S. Army intercepted a band of Lakota near Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. Soldiers opened fire, killing more than 250 Native men, women, and children. The ghost dance movement, once filled with spiritual hope, ended in blood and silence. From ritual to raccoon, the next American moment is less tragic, but no less bizarre, because our next president kept a leash-walking raccoon in the White House. Her name was Rebecca. Calvin Coolidge and his pet raccoon. Calvin Coolidge, the famously quiet 30th president, didn't say much, but his choice of pets said plenty. Among the menagerie he kept at the White House was Rebecca, a raccoon gifted to him for Thanksgiving dinner in 1926. Most people would have roasted her. Coolidge adopted her. Rebecca quickly became part of the presidential household. She was given her own collar and leash and regularly strolled the White House grounds under the watchful eye of the staff. Coolidge reportedly let her sit on his shoulder, ride in limousines, and even attend events. When asked why he kept her, the president simply said, "She's a real sport." This was not unusual for the Coolidges, who also kept a wallaby, a pygmy hippo, and a small zoo's worth of exotic animals during their time in office. But Rebecca was the crowd favorite. She even had a Christmas stocking. Her presence added a touch of oddball charm to an otherwise buttoned-up presidency. And while Coolidge was parading his pet, the military had plans of their own. Plans that involved building something totally transparent and sinking it. Welcome to the world of see-through submarines. The see-through submarine experiment. Somewhere in the curious intersection of military innovation and sheer sci-fi madness lies the U.S. Navy's attempt to build a see-through submarine. The idea was as clear as it was absurd. What if submarines could be made of transparent material to evade detection or offer better visibility for scientific missions? Think stealth mode meets glass bottom boat, but for spies and torpedoes. The plan wasn't pure fantasy. Engineers toyed with acrylics, reinforced glass, and high-strength polymers. imagining submersibles that could dive deep without sacrificing structural integrity. The appeal was obvious: complete visual awareness in murky depths, easier training for navigators, and a potential edge in Cold War surveillance. But then reality hit. Pressure at depth, the fragility of transparent materials, and the sheer cost of producing such vessels turned the dream into a logistical nightmare. Despite some prototype concepts and limited test modules, the see-through submarine never made it past the drawing board in any functional way. It remains a peculiar footnote in naval history, equal parts brilliance and Bond-villain flair. And from semi-invisible warfare, we pivot to a far more tangible conflict. One sparked not by submarines or strategy, but by a severed ear and a thirst for empire: the War of Jenkins' Ear. The War of Jenkins' Ear. It started with an ear in a jar. In 1731, British Captain Robert Jenkins was reportedly intercepted by Spanish coast guards near the Caribbean. During a tense confrontation, his ear was sliced off, allegedly as punishment for smuggling. Jenkins preserved the ear in alcohol and brought it back to England like the world's worst souvenir. Years later, in 1739, that mutilated ear helped spark a war between Britain and Spain, and American colonial forces were dragged along for the ride. The conflict, officially titled the War of Jenkins' Ear, was more than just a grudge match. It was part of a larger global rivalry over trade routes, naval supremacy, and colonial territories. Fought primarily in the Caribbean and along the southern British colonies, the war saw disastrous campaigns, failed sieges, and a whole lot of tropical disease. American colonists fought alongside British troops, gaining early experience in warfare that would shape their later revolutions. And the ear? It became a macabre symbol, paraded in Parliament and public halls as a rallying cry for honor and revenge. The war eventually merged into the War of the Austrian Succession, but the name stuck, and the ear stayed infamous. From ears to jaws, we move to another bizarre White House pet: the alligators that roamed under Hoover's roof. Herbert Hoover's free-roaming alligators. In the pantheon of strange presidential pets, Herbert Hoover's alligators deserve their own marble statue. Unlike dogs or raccoons or even cows, alligators aren't exactly known for their snuggle factor. Yet during Hoover's presidency in the early 1930s, 2 alligators took up residence in the White House, and not in a cage or a moat, but roaming freely around the grounds. Gifted to Hoover by a political supporter from the South, the alligators were supposed to be exotic tokens of goodwill. Hoover, never one to overreact, accepted them with the casual air of someone receiving a fruit basket. The reptiles were kept in a bathtub for a while, then let loose to patrol the White House's interior halls and nearby outdoor areas. Staff reportedly tiptoed around them, and visitors were warned to watch their step, literally. It wasn't the first time gators had prowled the executive mansion. John Quincy Adams allegedly had one too. But Hoover's pair became symbolic of an era teetering between opulence and absurdity. At a time when the nation was sinking into the Great Depression, the idea of alligators wandering the people's house was equal parts surreal and oddly appropriate. And just when you think the CIA couldn't get weirder, enter the Spy Cat. Project Acoustic Kitty, the CIA's feline flop. Only in the twisted genius of Cold War espionage could someone look at a house cat and think, yeah, that could be a spy. Thus was born Project Acoustic Kitty, one of the CIA's most ambitious and utterly bizarre surveillance experiments. The plan? Surgically implant a microphone, antenna, and power source inside a cat, turning it into a walking, purring wiretap capable of eavesdropping on Soviet conversations. The logic was as strange as it was bold. Cats were agile, unobtrusive, and able to slip into locations humans couldn't. So in the 1960s, with considerable funding and zero regard for feline preferences, CIA operatives went to work. They trained a gray and white tabby to obey basic commands, outfitted it with the tech, and released it for its first mission, only to watch in horror as the cat was immediately hit by a taxi. Mission failed. The program was quietly shut down, costing millions and producing zero intel. Acoustic Kitty became a cautionary tale inside the agency, a story passed around with the sheepish tone of a spy novel gone horribly wrong. From covert cats to puritanical chaos, the next tale jumps centuries back to a time when bad dreams could get you hanged. The infamous Salem witch trials. The Salem witch trials, Salem, Massachusetts, 1692. A town gripped by fear, paranoia, and religious fervor, descended into one of the darkest and most absurd chapters of early American history. Over the course of a year, more than 200 people were accused of witchcraft. 20 were executed. Most of the accused were women, many of them elderly, poor, or socially awkward. Their crime? Anything from a bad reputation to a neighbor's misfortune, to simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It began with a group of young girls who claimed to be possessed. They screamed, contorted, and accused townspeople of casting spells on them. The community, already simmering with tension, exploded. Trials were held. Evidence included spectral visions, odd birthmarks, and even dreams. Rationality evaporated. Fear took its place. Eventually, the madness burned out. The courts were disbanded, and some of the judges publicly repented. But the damage was done. The Salem witch trials remain a terrifying example of what happens when superstition, religious extremism, and mob mentality are given a gavel. And while witches were being hunted in the 1600s, a very different kind of obsession soothed the future president's nerves, one tiny stamp at a time. FDR's therapy, stamp collecting. Franklin Delano Roosevelt led the country through the Great Depression, World War II, and an era of seismic transformation. Yet amid the global chaos, FDR found personal peace in one of the quietest hobbies imaginable, stamp collecting. A lifelong philatelist, Roosevelt used stamps not just as collectibles, but as tiny windows into culture, history, and momentary escape. He didn't just glance at them, he curated them meticulously. His personal collection numbered in the tens of thousands, organized and maintained even during the hardest years of his presidency. While generals debated battle plans and advisors drafted economic reforms, Roosevelt would unwind in the Oval Office by arranging his albums, selecting new editions, and pondering potential designs for future issues. Stamp collecting gave him a sense of control, order, and beauty. Everything the outside world was often lacking. He even involved himself in the selection of U.S. stamp themes during his presidency, turning the hobby into a subtle form of national storytelling. And as he carefully sorted images of foreign lands and past presidents, New York was preparing for a blackout so intense it made the city look like the end of the world. The Great New York City Blackout of 1977. At 9:36 p.m. on July 13, 1977, New York City blinked and then went completely dark. A lightning strike upstate triggered a cascade of failures, knocking out the entire electrical grid across the 5 boroughs. The timing couldn't have been worse. The city was already teetering on the edge. Economic crisis, social unrest, and a sweltering heat wave pressing down like a lid. When the lights went out, so did the city's sense of control. What followed was chaos. Unlike the more peaceful 1965 blackout, this one erupted into looting, arson, and vandalism. Over 1,600 stores were ransacked. More than 1,000 fires were set. Police stations were overwhelmed, and emergency services were stretched thin. Neighborhoods like Bushwick and the South Bronx looked like war zones by sunrise. Yet amid the mayhem, stories of resilience emerged. Neighbors looked after each other. Bodega owners defended their stores. Communities rallied to clean up. Still, the damage was immense, both physically and psychologically. The blackout became a symbol of New York's darkest era. The 70s grime, the fiscal collapse, the crumbling infrastructure. And while the city fought to stay lit, the federal government was drowning in oil and scandal. Enter the Teapot Dome. The Teapot Dome scandal. It had everything. secret deals, corrupt officials, and a rock formation that looked like a teapot. The Teapot Dome scandal of the 1920s wasn't just the biggest political scandal of its time. It set the gold standard for American corruption until Watergate came along. At the center of it was Albert B. Fall, President Harding's Secretary of the Interior, and a few $100 million worth of naval oil reserves. Instead of putting the leases up for competitive bidding, Fall secretly granted drilling rights to his friends in the oil industry. In return, he received loans and gifts that totaled over $400,000, a staggering sum at the time. The bribes were disguised with such flimsy paperwork they might as well have been written on cocktail napkins. When news broke, the public was outraged. Congressional hearings followed. Fall was convicted of bribery and became the first U.S. cabinet member to go to prison for crimes committed in office. Teapot Dome became shorthand for government betrayal, and Harding's administration never recovered from the stain. Meanwhile, another president was making history, not for scandal, but for adopting a pet with international flair and fur, America's first Siamese cat. Rutherford B. Hayes and the first Siamese cat in America. Rutherford B. Hayes wasn't exactly a headline-grabbing president, but he did manage to make one adorable mark on American history. In 1879, during his time in the White House, Hayes received an exotic gift from the American consul in Bangkok, a Siamese cat named Siam. She was the first of her kind to set paw on U.S. soil, and she was treated like feline royalty. Siam quickly became a household fixture in the Hayes family, roaming the White House with regal indifference. At a time when cats were more associated with barns than drawing rooms, her presence added a strange new charm to the executive mansion. Siam's pale coat and striking blue eyes captivated staff and visitors alike. She wasn't just a pet. She was a living, purring ambassador from Southeast Asia. Unfortunately, Siam didn't live long after arriving, but her brief White House residency opened the door for the breed's popularity in America. In the decades to come, Siamese cats would become one of the country's most beloved and recognizable breeds. And while Hayes was basking in the elegance of Siam, a far more rickety dream was about to take flight. America's first attempt at a flying car, the Flying Flivver, Ford's skybound fantasy. In the 1920s, the automobile had already revolutionized the world, but Henry Ford had his eyes on the clouds. Enter the Flying Flivver, a tiny single-seat airplane that Ford hoped would become the Model T of the skies. Cheap, compact, and personal, it was supposed to make flying as commonplace as driving. Ford envisioned Americans zipping through the air to work, to stores, to visit family, with their own wings parked in backyard hangars. It was an ambitious leap, and the Flying Flivver looked like a cartoon version of a fighter plane, small enough to be carried by one person, powered by a 3-cylinder engine, and light as a feather. Initial test flights were promising. Ford hyped it up with press events and demo runs. But then came disaster. In 1928, a test pilot and close friend of the Ford family, Harry Brooks, crashed into the ocean during a trial flight and was killed. The incident devastated Ford and ended the project almost overnight. The dream of an affordable, everyday personal aircraft was grounded. But the idea never really died. It simply evolved into every sci-fi vision of the future. And speaking of flights of protest, next comes a tea party that brewed rebellion stronger than any pot in Boston. The Boston Tea Party, not just about tea. Everyone remembers the Boston Tea Party as a rowdy group of patriots tossing crates of tea into the harbor. But it wasn't just about taxation. It was about monopoly. Specifically, the British East India Company's chokehold on the colonial tea trade. When Parliament gave the company the exclusive right to sell tea to the colonies and dodge taxes others had to pay, it triggered more than outrage. It triggered organized economic sabotage. On December 16, 1773, colonists disguised as Mohawk warriors boarded 3 British ships docked in Boston Harbor. In total silence, they dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. Nearly 92,000 pounds of the stuff. That wasn't just symbolic. It was an economic punch to the throat. The tea's value in today's money well over $1 million. The British response was swift and brutal. The Coercive Acts, which shut down Boston's port and effectively declared war on the colony. The Tea Party became a flashpoint that pushed moderate colonists toward full-blown revolution. And while some Americans were making history by dumping beverages into the sea, one president preferred to dip himself, naked, into a river every morning. Yes, John Quincy Adams went full primal. John Quincy Adams and his morning skinny dips. John Quincy Adams wasn't just America's 6th president. He was also the nation's first presidential streaker. Every morning, like clockwork, Adams would rise before dawn, strip completely naked, and plunge into the Potomac River for a swim. This was no spa day. It was his daily ritual, his version of a cold plunge, and one that he maintained even while holding the highest office in the land. Washington, D.C. was still a swampy, mosquito-infested proto-capital back then, and the river was more mud bath than meditation pool. But Adams swam anyway, regardless of weather or presidential responsibilities. He believed it kept him mentally sharp and physically tough, traits he felt a leader should maintain. Legend has it that one morning, a female journalist named Anne Royal, eager for an interview, sat on his clothes while he swam and refused to give them back until he agreed to answer her questions. Whether true or apocryphal, the story cemented Adams's reputation as both eccentric and stubborn. While Adams was cooling off in the river, the Union would later look to the skies for surveillance, relying not on satellites, but on the gentlest giants of the air. Hot air balloons. Hot air balloons in the Civil War. Before drones, before helicopters, even before airplanes, there were balloons. And during the American Civil War, the Union Army tried to float its way to military supremacy using literal hot air. The concept was simple. Take a hydrogen-filled balloon, tie a basket underneath, lift an observer high into the sky, and give them a bird's-eye view of the battlefield. It was the birth of American aerial reconnaissance. These balloonists would ascend with a pair of binoculars and sometimes even a telegraph line trailing down to the ground, relaying real-time updates on Confederate troop movements. The most famous of these sky scouts was Thaddeus Lowe, who not only flew the balloons, but also advocated for an official balloon corps. President Lincoln approved, and soon the Union had a full fleet of gas bags with names like the Intrepid and the Eagle. Despite its groundbreaking innovation, the balloon corps didn't last. Military brass were skeptical, supply lines were hard to maintain, and Confederate sharpshooters eventually learned to aim upward. But the legacy stuck. The Union's floating eyes were the great-grandfathers of modern aerial intelligence. And while soldiers were being lifted into the clouds, civilians were lifting themselves onto flagpoles for days at a time, in the name of fame and absurdity. Flagpole sitting and dance marathons, roaring 20s madness. The 1920s roared in more ways than one. Sure, jazz was booming, bootleggers were thriving, and the Charleston was in full swing. But this was also the decade of some of the most bizarre public endurance stunts in U.S. history. Chief among them, flagpole sitting and dance marathons. Flagpole sitting started as a dare and quickly morphed into a national craze. Participants, usually young men with more guts than sense, would perch atop flagpoles for hours, days, even weeks. The record soared past 49 days. Crowds gathered below. Radio stations broadcast updates. Sponsors lined up. The higher and longer someone sat, the greater the glory. Not to be outdone, dance marathons brought the absurdity down to ground level. Couples would dance non-stop, resting only in brief intervals for days on end, sometimes weeks. It was part competition, part circus, and part Depression-era survival tactic. Winners earned money. Losers got blisters, dehydration, and emotional breakdowns, often right there on the dance floor. These spectacles weren't just weird, they were cultural mirrors. They reflected America's hunger for attention, distraction, and spectacle during times of wild prosperity and creeping anxiety. And speaking of excessive flair, our next president didn't just lead. He dressed like a runway model in trousers galore. Chester A. Arthur, the fashion president. Chester A. Arthur didn't come to politics with fanfare. He came with fabric, fine, tailored, exquisite fabric. Known as the gentleman boss, Arthur was perhaps the most fashion-obsessed president in U.S. history. Before he ever signed a bill or gave a speech, he was already famous in D.C. for his impeccable wardrobe. Rumor has it he owned over 80 pairs of trousers, rotated multiple outfits daily, and had his own personal valet just for managing his clothing. But his obsession wasn't just vanity. Arthur understood image as power. Rising from political obscurity to the presidency after James Garfield's assassination, he used his appearance to assert legitimacy. The mustache? Perfectly waxed. The suits? Always sharp. The White House? Completely redecorated in the style of Manhattan's elite salons. He even had fresh flowers delivered daily and refused to let the building look shabby. Beneath the silken style, Arthur was surprisingly effective, signing into law the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act and shaking off the machine politics that had helped raise him. Still, for many, he'll always be remembered as the best-dressed man to ever sit in the Oval Office. And while Arthur was measuring inseams, the nation was measuring something much stranger. Spaghetti. By the ton. The great American spaghetti-o-meter. In the land of drive-through freedom fries and county fair deep-fried everything, it was only a matter of time before America tried to measure its pasta consumption, officially. Thus emerged the utterly real, absolutely absurd spaghetti-o-meter, a government-sponsored initiative that did exactly what it sounds like. It measured how much spaghetti Americans were eating. Why? To better understand national food trends, of course. Also because, why not? This oversized novelty contraption was a public relations stunt masked as statistical research. It tracked spaghetti imports, domestic production, and per capita consumption, all visualized through a comically large measuring device, sometimes displayed at trade shows or food expos. At its core, it was part of a mid-20th century campaign to encourage Americans to eat more pasta, especially as immigrant cuisines like Italian food became mainstream. Though the spaghetti-o-meter never became as iconic as the food pyramid, it serves as a snapshot of America's culinary marketing phase. Goofy, ambitious, and slightly surreal. It showed just how deeply food was entwined with culture, commerce, and national identity, even if it was measured by a giant pasta-themed gimmick. And while spaghetti was flowing freely, the East Coast was about to get buried under nature's own massive serving, a historic blizzard for the ages. The Great Blizzard of 1888, March 11th, 1888. Without warning, the sky over the northeastern United States turned white and furious. What began as rain quickly transformed into one of the deadliest and most paralyzing snowstorms in American history. The Great Blizzard of 1888, also known as the Great White Hurricane, unleashed its fury from the Chesapeake Bay to Maine, burying cities under as much as 55 inches of snow and whipping up wind gusts over 80 miles per hour. New York City, Philadelphia, Boston, every major hub on the East Coast was brought to its knees. Trains stopped dead on their tracks. Telegraph lines collapsed. Horses froze in the streets. People were stranded in offices, schools, and stores for days, surviving on whatever food they could scavenge. Snowdrifts piled up to second-story windows. Over 400 people died, including many who froze to death trying to get home. The disaster exposed America's infrastructure vulnerabilities and forced changes. Cities began building underground utility lines and developing subway systems, starting with Boston in 1897. It was a tragedy, but also a turning point in urban planning. From nature's icy wrath, we turn to the fiery brilliance of a president who could write in two ancient languages at the same time. James Garfield's ambidextrous brilliance. James A. Garfield didn't just become president. He earned it the hard way. Born in a log cabin and raised in poverty, Garfield was a self-made intellectual powerhouse. Among his many remarkable talents, one stood out in dazzling, almost parlor-trick fashion. He was ambidextrous to the point of scholarly showmanship. Garfield could write in Latin with one hand and ancient Greek with the other, simultaneously. Whether he actually did this regularly or only as a party trick is up for debate, but the fact remains that Garfield was a linguistic prodigy. He worked as a classics professor before entering politics, and his love of language and logic shaped both his rhetoric and his policy. His brain was sharp enough to rival any 19th century intellectual, and this was a century obsessed with intellectualism. Sadly, his brilliance was cut short. Garfield was assassinated just 4 months into his term, dying months later from infection due to primitive medical practices. America lost one of its most promising minds before he could leave a lasting legacy. And while Garfield's ambidextrous mind was dazzling scholars, the military was getting help from an entirely different species, sniffing out nukes, one tail wag at a time. Nuclear bloodhounds, dogs on the atomic trail. During the Cold War, as the U.S. stockpiled nuclear weapons like a doomsday hoarder, one terrifying possibility loomed large. What if one went missing? The answer, at least for a brief and bizarre chapter in military history, was dogs. Trained dogs, with sniffers tuned not to drugs or bombs, but to the specific chemical scents associated with nuclear warheads. The idea was to use dogs to track down lost nukes, because yes, there were incidents where weapons were misplaced, dropped, or otherwise unaccounted for during transport or crashes. These weren't Hollywood fantasies. They were real scenarios. And so, in government labs and classified training grounds, dogs were taught to detect the unique scent signatures of high explosives and special nuclear materials like plutonium and uranium. The dogs performed surprisingly well. Their noses could pick up faint traces, even buried or underwater. But as detection technology improved and the secrecy around nuclear materials increased, the canine program faded into the shadows of military obscurity. Still, for a brief moment, America put its atomic trust in man's best friend. And while four-legged friends sniffed out disaster, the nation once raised a right hand in a pledge that looked eerily familiar, until history forced a rebrand. The Pledge of Allegiance's forgotten salute. Before there was the over-heart hand placement we know today, the Pledge of Allegiance came with a different gesture. A stiff-armed salute extended toward the flag. It was known as the Bellamy Salute, named after Francis Bellamy, who penned the original pledge in 1892. At the time, it was meant to symbolize unity, loyalty, and national pride. But as the 20th century marched on, something changed. Across the Atlantic, a chillingly similar gesture became the salute of fascist regimes, most infamously, the Nazi salute. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. Footage from school assemblies and patriotic parades in the U.S. began to look wrong. Too close. Too dangerous. By the early 1940s, with World War II in full swing, public discomfort reached a tipping point. In 1942, Congress officially changed the salute to the now familiar right hand over the heart. A symbolic distancing. A necessary pivot. Overnight, a tradition was erased and rewritten. It's a strange footnote. How quickly something can go from patriotic to problematic when the winds of history shift. And while politics were changing the way we swore allegiance, another president quietly governed, without a second-in-command at all. Enter Millard Fillmore, the solo act. Millard Fillmore and the VP that never was. Millard Fillmore became president in 1850 under somber circumstances. He was Zachary Taylor's vice president and was thrust into the top job when Taylor died suddenly from what was likely a mix of heat stroke and bad milk. But what makes Fillmore truly unique in the annals of presidential trivia? He never appointed a new vice president. For the rest of his term, the office simply sat vacant. This wasn't a glitch. At the time, there was no constitutional provision for replacing a vice president mid-term. If the VP died, resigned, or took over the presidency, the role stayed empty until the next election. So Fillmore ruled solo. No tiebreaker in the Senate, no spare heart attack insurance, no backup co-pilot. It's wild to think about today, when a vice president is just one heartbeat away from nuclear codes and press junkets. But in the 1850s, it was just shrugged off. Fillmore carried on, pushing forward the Compromise of 1850 and trying, unsuccessfully, to keep the Union from boiling over. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't beloved, but he made history by omission, governing with no second chair, no wingman, and no Veep. And while Fillmore left a void in the White House, another void was forming across the Atlantic. A famine that would flood America with new voices and stories. The Great Potato Famine and America's Irish influx. From 1845 to 1852, Ireland endured one of the most devastating famines in modern history. The cause? A relentless blight that turned potatoes, the staple food of millions, into rotting mush. The result? Mass starvation, death, and one of the largest waves of migration the United States had ever seen. Over 1 million Irish fled the famine, and America became the beacon of survival across the sea. The Irish immigrants who arrived brought their language, music, labor, and grit, but also faced immediate hostility. They were poor, Catholic, different. Signs reading "No Irish need apply" weren't just folklore, they were real. Cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia became pressure cookers of prejudice and perseverance. But the Irish endured. They dug canals, built railroads, became police officers and politicians. They transformed the labor force and reshaped the American city. And within a generation, Irish surnames were etched into the fabric of the country. O'Malley, Kennedy, Sullivan. The famine was a tragedy, but its aftermath was a human wave that helped define what America would become. A chaotic, conflicted, immigrant-forged republic. And as one addiction, potatoes, left a hole in the Irish heart, another addiction was taking root in the American lung, with a ridiculous twist. The smokeless cigarette. The smokeless cigarette that stank up the 80s. In the 1980s, the U.S. took a swing at innovation and missed by a mile. Enter the smokeless cigarette, marketed as the future of clean nicotine. The idea was simple. Deliver a tobacco hit without the pesky smoke, ash, or obvious carcinogenic cloud. It was part cigarette, part gadget, part public relations band-aid for a dying industry under fire from medical watchdogs. But it didn't work. At all. The product, sometimes dubbed the safe smoke or smoke-free cig, was essentially a heated rod of tobacco. You lit it like a normal cigarette, but instead of burning, it cooked the tobacco, releasing a vapor. Sounds modern, right? Except the vapor stank. Not just cigarette-level stank, worse. Chemical, nauseating. Imagine licking the inside of a microwave after it explodes a meatloaf. That kind of bad. Smokers hated it. Non-smokers hated it. Even health officials who were no friends to big tobacco rolled their eyes. The product flopped hard, and it quietly disappeared from shelves almost as quickly as it arrived. And while American lungs were reeling from this no-smoke horror, one very unconventional First Lady was preparing to take the national stage, with a president old enough to be her dad. Frances Folsom Cleveland, First Lady at 21. When Frances Folsom became First Lady in 1886, she wasn't just stepping into the White House, she was stepping into history. At 21, she remains the youngest First Lady ever. Her husband, President Grover Cleveland, was 49. The age gap was noticeable. The wedding took place in the White House, the only time a sitting president has married there, and it sent Washington society into a frenzy. The public was fascinated. Frances was young, stylish, educated, and photogenic. Newspapers breathlessly reported on her fashion choices, her social life, even her handwriting. She became America's first media-savvy First Lady, a proto-celebrity who helped soften Cleveland's gruff image. Crowds gathered just to watch her walk by. Women copied her hair. Men wrote her love letters. But she wasn't just arm candy. Frances took her role seriously, managing White House receptions, advising her husband, and shaping public perceptions during a turbulent time in American politics. Her youth was a weapon, used not to diminish her, but to modernize the presidency. And while Frances was modernizing the First Lady's role, Engineers were dreaming up a future that tunneled beneath the continent itself. An underground America no one ever saw. America's underground tunnel ambitions. In the golden age of American ambition, when why not often trumped should we, engineers and futurists proposed a sprawling network of underground tunnels crisscrossing the United States. Not subways, not bomb shelters. We're talking full-blown coast-to-coast subterranean highways and rail systems. An intercontinental mole world of transport. The idea gained traction throughout the 20th century, especially during the 1950s and 60s, when Cold War paranoia, urban congestion, and nuclear fears made underground life seem oddly appealing. Some proposals envisioned tunnels, with vacuum-sealed trains zipping along at hundreds of miles per hour. Others imagined highways where cars would drive below ground to bypass surface traffic, or even avoid radiation fallout in case of nuclear war. Of course, these ideas faced a few problems, like cost, engineering complexity, the small issue of digging through entire mountain ranges and flood zones. Still, cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles did build segments of these dreams in miniature. Freight tunnels, mail delivery systems, secret service routes. The full vision never materialized. But the dream lingers, echoed today in Hyperloop proposals and Elon Musk's love affair with tunnel boring machines. And speaking of underground rebellion, the next story burrows into America's coal-black heart, where Irish miners struck back from the shadows. The Molly Maguires, underground resistance. In the gritty coal towns of 19th century Pennsylvania, miners toiled in darkness, crushed by dangerous conditions and brutal wages. Among the Irish immigrants who worked the mines, a secret society formed, part protest movement, part revenge squad. They were called the Molly Maguires. Their origins traced back to similar groups in Ireland, where peasants fought back against landlords with midnight raids and whispered threats. In America, the Mollies took root among the anthracite miners, whose lives were marked by cave-ins, black lung, and exploitation by powerful coal barons. The Molly Maguires used clandestine methods: arson, sabotage, and, in extreme cases, assassination. They targeted mine bosses, scabs, and Pinkerton agents. The coal companies, in response, hired their own spies, most famously James McParland, who infiltrated the group and later testified in a trial that led to the hanging of 10 supposed Molly members in 1877. To this day, historians debate whether the Molly Maguires were freedom fighters or terrorists, heroes or outlaws. What's undeniable is that they sparked one of the earliest, bloodiest labor conflicts in U.S. history. And from smoky mines to steam-powered prestige, we jump to a president who ditched the horse and made history in a car that ran on boiling water. William McKinley's locomobile ride. In the late 1890s, cars were still more curiosity than commonplace. Most Americans had never seen one. But William McKinley, 25th President of the United States, helped change that with one steamy little ride. During his presidency, McKinley became the first sitting president to ride in an automobile, specifically a locomobile steam car. It wasn't just a joyride, it was a statement. The locomobile was powered by steam, required constant refueling with water and kerosene, and had all the subtlety of a hissing pressure cooker on wheels. But to the public, it was futuristic, daring, and incredibly loud. McKinley's ride symbolized a shift. America wasn't just growing, it was accelerating. His choice to embrace the newfangled machine reflected a growing national obsession with speed, technology, and modernity. It also gave the press something to drool over. Photographers snapped shots, reporters scribbled details. The White House wasn't just a seat of power, it was becoming a showroom. McKinley's steam-powered debut didn't make cars mainstream overnight, but it nudged the culture forward. Within 2 decades, automobiles would dominate American roads. And while McKinley was riding the future, another branch of the military was cooking up a defense plan so absurd it could have come from a sci-fi comic. Lasers in the sky. America's Cold War laser dreams. During the Cold War, America wasn't just building bombs, it was dreaming in beams. One of the wildest proposals to come out of this era was the development of a massive, high-powered laser system designed to shoot down enemy missiles. Yes, lasers. Like something out of Star Wars, decades before George Lucas even finished editing the first film. The program wasn't entirely fantasy. Military scientists explored the possibility of using directed energy weapons to intercept incoming threats, especially Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. The concept was simple in theory. Detect a missile, target it with a laser from space or a high-altitude aircraft, and burn it out of the sky before it ever reached U.S. soil. In practice, not so simple. The technology wasn't quite ready. The power needed to make such lasers effective was enormous, and the systems required pinpoint accuracy under extreme conditions. The few test models that were built were large, clunky, and dangerously unreliable. Still, the dream never fully died. Laser weapons resurfaced under Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative in the 1980s and continue to appear in modern defense research. But if you think high-tech warfare defined the Wild West, think again. Out on the frontier, justice was served with revolvers, not ray guns. The short-lived Wild West. The Wild West looms large in American mythology. Outlaws, saloons, gunfights at high noon. But the truth is, this dusty, lawless era was surprisingly short-lived. From about 1865 to 1895, roughly 3 decades, the American West saw its most iconic moments: cattle drives, gold rushes, and those infamous duels over whiskey and honor. In reality, towns like Dodge City and Tombstone didn't stay wild for long. Railroads brought order. Telegraph lines brought news. And lawmen, with their tin stars and booming voices, brought a form of peace, often just as violent as the chaos they replaced. By the early 1900s, most wild Western towns had been tamed, paved, and incorporated. What remained was the legend. Buffalo Bill's traveling shows, dime novels, and later, Hollywood westerns that stretched this brief, bloody chapter into an eternal American epic. But the facts are clear. The Wild West, as most imagine it, was a cultural supernova. Bright, brief, and heavily dramatized. As tumbleweeds were fading into postcards, a different kind of paranoia was rising. A fear that the Soviets were packing more missiles than we were. Welcome to the age of the missile gap. Harry Truman and the Missile Gap Panic. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, as the Cold War shifted from chill to full-blown frostbite, American leaders started to worry. What if the Soviet Union had more missiles than we did? Thus was born the Great Missile Gap Scare, a psychological arms race as much as a technological one. And it was Harry S. Truman who first grappled with its implications as president. Though the full-blown panic didn't peak until the Eisenhower and Kennedy years, Truman's administration laid the groundwork. As nuclear technology evolved, Truman's advisors raised alarms that the U.S. might be falling behind. The Soviets had detonated their first atomic bomb in 1949, far sooner than expected. American intelligence scrambled to estimate how many warheads Moscow had and how fast they could deliver them. The problem? Much of the data was speculative, exaggerated, or just plain wrong. But that didn't stop the fear from taking hold. The idea of a missile gap influenced military budgets, foreign policy, and public rhetoric for years. And while Truman was dodging invisible missiles, another secret program was going vertical, launching nukes into space to light up the cosmos in the name of science. Project Argus, nukes in space. In 1958, the United States looked up at the night sky and thought, let's blow it up. Thus began Project Argus, one of the strangest, most top-secret nuclear experiments of the Cold War. The goal? Detonate atomic bombs in space to study their effects on Earth's magnetosphere, radar systems, and potential missile defense strategies. Because nothing screams peace through science like lobbing nuclear warheads into orbit. Conducted by the U.S. Navy, Argus launched 3 low-yield nuclear devices aboard rockets from the South Atlantic. The bombs exploded hundreds of miles above the Earth, creating artificial radiation belts and aurora-like light shows visible from thousands of miles away. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was utterly insane. The data gathered informed both military strategy and scientific research. Argus proved that nuclear detonations could disrupt communications and radar across the globe. Critical intel in a world where radar ruled warfare. It also served as a wake-up call to the global community about the dangers of militarizing space. The project was declassified years later, leaving behind one glowing legacy: don't mess with the magnetosphere. And while America was lighting up the heavens, back on Earth, farmers in Oklahoma were preparing to light something else: green corn, revolution, and resistance. The Green Corn Rebellion. In 1917, as World War I raged overseas, a very different kind of war brewed in rural Oklahoma. The Green Corn Rebellion wasn't led by soldiers or politicians. It was fueled by poor tenant farmers, socialists, Native Americans, and black sharecroppers, all united by one burning belief. They weren't going to fight someone else's war. Many of these farmers were already angry, crushed by debt, exploited by landlords, and watching their sons get drafted into a war they didn't believe in. Inspired by radical anti-war movements and fueled by desperation, hundreds of them plotted an armed uprising. The plan? March to Washington, D.C., surviving off roasted green corn along the way, and spark a nationwide rebellion against the draft. Spoiler: it didn't go well. The rebellion was discovered before it really started. Most of the conspirators were arrested, some served time, and the uprising fizzled. But it left a mark. It showed how deep resistance ran, even in the heartland, and it highlighted the strange intersections of war, class, race, and ideology in early 20th century America. From green corn to political near-death experiences, our next figure barely escaped impeachment by a single vote and changed presidential history forever. Andrew Johnson. Impeached, but not removed. Andrew Johnson was never meant to be president. A tailor by trade and a staunch Unionist from Tennessee, he became Abraham Lincoln's accidental successor after the assassination in 1865. But his presidency was a powder keg from the start. Radical Republicans wanted to punish the South. Johnson wanted to go easy on them. The result? A political brawl so bitter it ended with Johnson becoming the first U.S. president ever impeached. His offense? Violating the Tenure of Office Act by firing Secretary of War Edwin Stanton without Senate approval. But beneath the legalese was a deeper conflict. Congress thought Johnson was obstructing Reconstruction and rolling back civil rights for newly freed slaves. The House of Representatives voted to impeach him in 1868. Then came the trial in the Senate. The vote was razor thin. Johnson survived removal by exactly one vote, 35 guilty to 19 not guilty, just short of the two-thirds needed. The man clung to power, wounded, but still in office. Though he finished his term, Johnson left the White House politically gutted and widely loathed. But his trial set a precedent, one that every future president would remember when walking the razor's edge of power. And speaking of razor edges, the next experiment involved monkeys, aprons, and vacuuming. Yes, really. Teaching monkeys to do housework. In the realm of Cold War-era absurdities, this one belongs in the Hall of Fame. The U.S. government once seriously explored the idea of training monkeys to perform household chores. That's right, monkeys, in tiny aprons, operating vacuums, folding laundry, washing dishes. It sounds like a rejected Disney subplot, but it was part of a very real series of psychological and behavioral studies during the mid-20th century. At the heart of this was an attempt to understand the limits of animal intelligence, and more ambitiously, whether primates could be trained to assist disabled individuals or even function in military support roles. Researchers at various universities, often funded by government grants, taught monkeys complex tasks using repetition, rewards, and sometimes shockingly creative contraptions. There are records of monkeys sweeping floors, typing on rudimentary machines, even operating simple levers and pulleys for simulated chores. But like many overly optimistic experiments of the era, this one ran into, well, monkey business. The animals didn't exactly excel at long-term obedience. They got bored, distracted, sometimes aggressive. The idea that they'd replace domestic workers or soldiers' assistants never really materialized. From trained primates to blazing infernos, the next chapter scorches its way through history. One of the deadliest fires to ever hit an American city, the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. On the night of October 8, 1871, the city of Chicago was a tinderbox, hot, dry, and built almost entirely of wood. Then, somewhere near a small barn on the city's west side, a fire ignited. Legend blames Mrs. O'Leary's cow for kicking over a lantern, but the truth remains uncertain. What is certain is what happened next. Hell broke loose. The fire burned for 2 days. It devoured over 3 square miles of the city, leveling more than 17,000 buildings. Nearly 100,000 people, about a third of Chicago's population, were left homeless. Winds turned embers into firestorms. Flames leapt rivers. The inferno became its own weather system, creating a fiery vortex of destruction. But as catastrophic as the fire was, the rebuilding was just as legendary. Out of the ashes, Chicago rose stronger and more ambitious than ever. Architects and engineers descended on the city, using it as a blank slate to design the modern metropolis. Steel, stone, and glass replaced timber. Skyscrapers were born. The fire was a tragedy, but it also sparked a revolution in urban planning and fire safety. Now, from infernos to international bear diplomacy, it's time to visit a president who got a very unusual Soviet gift. On 4 paws. LBJ and the Soviet bear cub. Lyndon B. Johnson was no stranger to weird moments in the Oval Office. He held meetings from the bathroom, gave reporters the Johnson treatment, and once owned a beagle named him and her. But perhaps the strangest item on his presidential inventory came from the Soviet Union. A live bear cub. Yes, during the Cold War, while both nations threatened mutual destruction, someone in the Soviet diplomatic corps decided the best way to thaw relations was a cuddly, if toothy, gift. The bear arrived as a goodwill gesture, though how exactly LBJ was supposed to interpret it remains unclear. Let's be friends? Don't poke the bear. Who knows? Rather than keeping the cub as a pet, LBJ did the responsible thing and donated it to the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. The gesture was briefly noted in the press, mostly as a footnote in the ever-escalating arms race of weird diplomacy. But the story serves as a perfect metaphor for Cold War relations, public smiles, private teeth, and the constant awareness that even the cutest gift could bite. Next up, back to the Air Force, where America tried to take the flying saucer out of science fiction and into reality. Project 1794, America's real-life flying saucer. In the 1950s, deep in the classified guts of the Cold War, the U.S. Air Force decided that what it really needed wasn't more jets, but a flying saucer. Project 1794 was born out of the belief that disc-shaped aircraft could revolutionize aerial combat. With vertical takeoff abilities, high-speed flight, and potential maneuverability that normal planes couldn't dream of, the saucer seemed like the future. Or at least the coolest toy in the Pentagon's garage. Engineers at Avro Canada were contracted to build the prototype. It was small, circular, and looked exactly like every 50s UFO sighting mashed into one. A spinning silver disc that supposedly could reach speeds up to Mach 4 and altitudes over 100,000 feet. In reality, the early models barely got off the ground. One prototype wobbled like a drunken hubcap, could only hover a few feet high, and was near impossible to steer. Still, the dream was real. The government sunk millions into the project, hoping to one-up Soviet tech and maybe, just maybe, defend America with something straight out of Pulp Fiction. Ultimately, it flopped. The project was quietly shelved, the documents declassified decades later. But while discs failed in the sky, disaster was marching across the land. one step at a time, on the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears wasn't a single path. It was a sprawling, government-mandated death march that stretched across thousands of miles and countless broken promises. Beginning in the 1830s, under President Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act, tens of thousands of Native Americans, particularly the Cherokee, but also the Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations, were forcibly uprooted from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States and marched west to what is now Oklahoma. It was one of the darkest, coldest acts in U.S. domestic policy. Entire communities were rounded up, held in prison-like encampments, and made to walk for months with inadequate supplies, harsh weather, and little regard for the old, the sick, or the young. Thousands died from starvation, exposure, and disease. Eyewitness accounts describe the road lined with graves, with soldiers under orders to keep people moving regardless of condition. The name Trail of Tears isn't metaphorical. It was literal. An entire population displaced in the name of expansion, profit, and cotton. It stands as a stark reminder that manifest destiny came with a body count, and that America's rise often came at the cost of its conscience. And as native nations were marched westward, the presidency was preparing to go airborne, thanks to one general turned commander-in-chief and a newly minted helicopter. Eisenhower's presidential helicopter liftoff. In 1957, President Dwight D. Eisenhower did something no commander-in-chief had done before. He climbed aboard a helicopter and lifted off from the White House lawn. It wasn't a stunt. It was history. Ike had officially become the first U.S. president to use a helicopter as part of official travel, setting the stage for a modern, high-flying presidency. Eisenhower had been a general, so it made sense he trusted military tech. The chopper wasn't just cool, it was practical. Washington traffic was already a nightmare, and with nuclear war always a looming threat, the White House needed a quick escape plan. The helicopter provided a fast, flexible exit from the Capitol, or a rapid link to Camp David and Andrews Air Force Base. The press loved it. Photos of the president waving from the helicopter steps gave off a superhero vibe, and soon, Marine One became a regular fixture in presidential life. Every president since Ike has used helicopters, but he was the pioneer, transforming how the executive branch moved and showing that the office was ready to rise above both gridlock and gravity. And as Eisenhower soared skyward, America's ambitions kept expanding. This time, with hopes of buying a Caribbean island that refused to be sold, America's repeated attempts to buy Cuba. Long before Cuba became a Cold War flashpoint, it was already sitting on America's shopping list. In the 19th century, the United States made several serious attempts to purchase the island from Spain, often cloaked in diplomacy, sometimes hinted with muscle. The reasoning, strategic location, economic potential, and a growing obsession with expanding the nation's influence in the Caribbean. One of the boldest efforts came in the 1850s with the Ostend Manifesto, a secret plan crafted by American diplomats that declared Cuba a natural extension of the U.S. If Spain refused to sell, the manifesto argued, the U.S. would be justified in taking it by force. Word leaked. The public was scandalized. The plan fell apart. But the offers didn't stop. Presidents from Thomas Jefferson to James Buchanan eyed Cuba as a future state, one that could potentially extend slavery, secure trade routes, and serve as a tropical jewel in America's crown. Spain, clinging to one of its last colonies, refused every time. Eventually, history took a different turn. Cuba gained independence through revolution, not purchase, and later, it became a communist neighbor that would haunt U.S. policy for decades. And speaking of neighbors fighting back, next comes a riot where suits sparked street warfare. Welcome to the Zoot Suit Riots. The Zoot Suit Riots. In June 1943, Los Angeles exploded. Not with bombs, but with fists, bats, and racial tension that had been building for years. The Zoot Suit Riots were a series of violent clashes between U.S. servicemen and Mexican-American youth. Recognizable by their extravagant zoot suits, all billowy pants, long jackets, and wide-brimmed hats. For many in white America, the suits were seen as unpatriotic during wartime rationing. For the wearers, they were statements of pride, resistance, and cultural identity. The trigger was complex. Tensions between military personnel stationed in L.A. and local Latino communities, a media-fueled narrative that painted young Chicanos as criminals, and an incident involving a sailor allegedly attacked by zoot suiters. What followed was chaos. Servicemen flooded the streets in mobs, stripping zoot suiters, beating them in broad daylight, sometimes in front of cheering crowds. Police arrested the victims, not the attackers. For several days, Los Angeles burned, not in flames, but in humiliation and hate. The riots revealed deep fractures in America's racial dynamics, even as it fought for freedom abroad. And in the political back rooms of that same post-war era, a future president was sharpening his poker face and using his winnings to fund his rise to power. Nixon's poker-fueled campaign fund. Before he was Tricky Dick, before Watergate and the White House, Richard Nixon was just another young Navy officer looking to get ahead. Stationed in the Pacific during World War II, Nixon discovered he had a surprising talent, not for espionage or strategy, but for poker. And not just decent poker, killer poker. He was known for playing tight, calculating hands and walking away from the table with other officers' paychecks safely folded in his pocket. By the time he returned home, Nixon had reportedly amassed thousands of dollars in winnings. Some accounts suggest over $6,000, which would be a small fortune in the 1940s. Rather than spending it frivolously, he bankrolled his first congressional campaign with it. And it worked. Nixon won a seat in the House in 1946, launching the political career that would eventually take him to the Oval Office. The poker game became part of Nixon's mythology. It painted him as savvy, strategic, even a little ruthless, qualities that would define both his rise and his eventual fall. He never denied the story. In fact, he leaned into it. And as Nixon bluffed and bet his way into Washington, America turned its eyes to the clouds, literally, with a plan to control the weather. America's weather control plans. During the Cold War, as America looked for new ways to outmaneuver nature and the Soviets, one wild-eyed idea kept resurfacing: weather control. In particular, the U.S. explored manipulating storms using silver iodide, a chemical compound that could seed clouds and potentially alter precipitation patterns. If rain could be summoned or storms diverted, the military and the government could gain unimaginable strategic and political power. The most famous version of this was Project Storm Fury, which aimed to weaken hurricanes by dropping silver iodide into their eye walls. The hope was that by freezing water droplets and disrupting convection, hurricanes could be drained of energy before making landfall. Test flights were conducted. Scientists monitored cloud formations. Some early results seemed promising. But nature, as always, had the last word. The atmosphere proved far more complex and unpredictable than expected. The data was inconsistent, and ethical concerns, like whether it was right to weaponize or manipulate weather, started piling up. Eventually, most of the programs were abandoned or scaled back. Still, the dream lingered, the idea that even the sky could be tamed. Meanwhile, as America tried to bend clouds to its will, it was also reshaping something smaller, but just as culturally influential: the humble postage stamp. The penny black's American echo. Before email and texting, before even telephones, the postage stamp was the lifeblood of communication. And while the U.S. proudly boasts its own stamp legacy, it owes a quiet debt to a tiny square of adhesive called the penny black. Issued in 1840 in Great Britain, it was the world's first postage stamp, and it inspired America's foray into postal design. The early U.S. stamps, launched in 1847, mirrored many aspects of the penny black's layout. They featured bold profile portraits, Benjamin Franklin and George Washington, and a utilitarian, no-frills look. Unlike modern stamps, these early issues weren't perforated. Postal clerks had to cut each one with scissors, giving each stamp a slightly jagged edge, like a poorly trimmed beard. Over time, the American stamp evolved into a miniature art gallery. Presidents, national parks, space missions, even Elvis. But the roots remain visible. The penny black's influence helped shape not just the design, but the very culture of collectible, commemorative postage in the U.S. And as ink and paper were crossing the nation, one president found himself on the wrong side of a galloping horse in a very awkward legal situation involving an old woman and a set of reins. Franklin Pierce's horse trouble. Franklin Pierce, the 14th president of the United States, didn't exactly leave a towering legacy, but he did manage to get arrested during his time in office. The charge? Running over an elderly woman with his horse. Yes, in the pre-automobile era, traffic accidents still happened, and this one landed the president himself in hot water. The incident occurred in Washington, D.C. while Pierce was out for a ride. His horse reportedly bolted, and the carriage struck the woman. She was seriously injured, and Pierce was detained by police. The case quickly drew attention, not just because of who was involved, but because the idea of a sitting president being arrested was nearly unthinkable at the time. However, the charges were quietly dropped. There were whispers of political pressure, insufficient evidence, and behind-the-scenes maneuvering. Pierce never publicly addressed the incident, and the woman's fate faded into the background of history. Still, the episode reinforced Pierce's reputation as an unlucky, often unsteady president, plagued by personal tragedy and public missteps. And while Pierce was struggling to stay in the public's good graces, the U.S. military was busy training something far more graceful: avian assassins with a mission to guard the skies. Falcons on patrol, air-based defense, feathered edition. In the annals of military oddities, training falcons to protect U.S. air bases from bird strikes might just be one of the most unexpectedly elegant solutions. Birds colliding with aircraft engines have long been a costly and deadly problem, especially during takeoff and landing. Enter nature's apex aerial predator. The military thought, why not fight birds with better birds? The idea wasn't just theoretical. In several air bases, particularly during the late 20th century, falconers were brought in to train and fly birds of prey to patrol the skies. These falcons, hawks, and even eagles were used to scare off flocks of smaller nuisance birds that could damage jet engines or obscure radar systems. Their presence alone was enough to clear the skies, but some were trained for more aggressive responses if needed. It wasn't high-tech, it was primal. And it worked. The falcons didn't just do the job efficiently, they did it with style, swooping and diving through the air like living missiles. Eventually, automated systems and sound cannons took over most airfield defense duties, but for a time, these raptors ruled the runways. And while falcons kept the skies clear, another kind of gold rush was underway. One that shouted Pikes Peak or bust all the way to Colorado. Pikes Peak Gold Rush, or bust, or die trying. In 1859, with the echoes of California's gold rush still ringing in American ears, prospectors set their sights on a new frontier, the Colorado Rockies. The slogan Pikes Peak or bust became the rallying cry of a feverish wave of migration toward the untapped mineral wealth of the West. But here's the twist. Most of the actual gold wasn't near Pikes Peak at all. Thousands of hopeful miners packed wagons, kissed families goodbye, and braved months-long treks into rugged wilderness. They believed fortunes awaited just beneath the dirt. What they found instead were harsh winters, unpredictable terrain, and boom towns that could vanish overnight. Denver and Boulder were among the cities that grew rapidly from this influx, transforming the region from a remote territory into a key player in U.S. expansion. Some struck it rich, most did not. Still, the rush played a pivotal role in expanding the American frontier and solidifying Colorado's path to statehood. And while men were risking it all for gold, one unlucky president risked too much at a 4th of July picnic and ended up paying the ultimate price with a bowl of cherries. Zachary Taylor's deadly dessert. Zachary Taylor, 12th President of the United States and hero of the Mexican-American War, had survived countless battlefields. But in the sweltering heat of July 4th, 1850, he met his match not in a bullet, but in a bowl of cherries and a glass of iced milk. After attending a long Independence Day celebration at the Washington Monument construction site, Taylor returned to the White House overheated, dehydrated, and ravenous. He reportedly consumed large amounts of cold milk and fresh cherries, a seemingly innocent treat. But within hours he was violently ill. Fever, cramps, vomiting. His condition worsened rapidly. 5 days later, he was dead. The official cause was gastroenteritis, likely brought on by contaminated food or water, though conspiracy theories have flourished for centuries, including claims of arsenic poisoning. Despite exhumation and testing in the 1990s, which found no evidence of foul play, the cherry milk combo remains infamously tied to Taylor's sudden demise. He became one of the few presidents to die in office from natural causes, and the only one possibly felled by fruit salad. And while Taylor was succumbing to nature's vengeance, scientists were busy weaponizing the brain itself. Because next up is the U.S. military's plan for a literal brain gun. The brain gun, Mind Games Military Edition. Somewhere deep in the labyrinth of Cold War experimentation, the U.S. military pursued a weapon so strange it barely seems real. A so-called brain gun that could incapacitate enemies not by bullets or bombs, but by scrambling their neural signals. Think electromagnetic pulses. Think directed energy. Think, what if we could make the enemy's brain short-circuit without ever touching them? This wasn't just science fiction fever. It was grounded in real attempts to explore non-lethal psychotronic warfare. The idea was that electromagnetic frequencies, specifically tailored microwave or radio waves, could disrupt brainwave activity, induce confusion, cause pain, or even paralyze. In theory, it was the ultimate silent takedown. No visible wound, just a sudden collapse. Programs reportedly tested various delivery methods, from handheld prototypes to theoretical satellite-based emitters. But progress was hampered by a few inconvenient truths, like the sheer complexity of the human brain, the unpredictability of electromagnetic fields, and the ethics of zapping someone's nervous system into submission. While no functional brain gun ever hit the battlefield, the research fed decades of conspiracy theories and pop culture lore, from tinfoil hats to mind control scares. And while scientists were toying with thought disruption, bleeding began in Kansas, foreshadowing a far greater war about to split the nation. Bleeding Kansas, prelude to Civil War. Before Gettysburg, before Fort Sumter, before the Union cracked in half, there was Kansas, a territory soaked in blood and ideology. In the mid-1850s, the Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed settlers to vote on whether their new state would permit slavery. What followed wasn't democracy. It was an armed invasion of beliefs. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces poured into the territory, each hoping to tip the scales. But they didn't come with ballots alone. They came with rifles, revolvers, and the full force of their conviction. Towns were burned. Families were slaughtered. Guerrilla raids became routine. And in 1856, abolitionist John Brown led a retaliatory massacre that carved his name into American memory. Bleeding Kansas wasn't just a nickname. It was prophecy. The territory became a microcosm of the coming Civil War, showing just how volatile the slavery debate had become. The federal government struggled to maintain order, and the violence exposed how fragile the Union truly was. Kansas would eventually enter the Union as a free state in 1861, but not before leaving a trail of corpses, fire, and a permanent scar on the nation's conscience. And from political firestorms to presidential vegetables, the next story involves broccoli, and a leader who declared total war on it from Air Force One. George H.W. Bush versus broccoli. In 1990, President George H.W. Bush declared one of the most unexpected and oddly relatable political stances in history. He hated broccoli, and not in a quiet, keep-it-off-my-plate way. He made it national news. "I do not like broccoli," he told reporters, "and I haven't liked it since I was a little kid, and my mother made me eat it. And I'm President of the United States now, and I'm not going to eat any more of it." The press had a field day. Late-night hosts couldn't resist. Broccoli farmers were furious. One group even sent several tons of the stuff to the White House in protest. Bush, unfazed, donated it to charity and doubled down on his leafy green vendetta. But the comment struck a chord. It was funny, weirdly honest, and deeply human. For a brief moment, the nation wasn't talking about foreign policy or deficits. They were talking about vegetables. The broccoli declaration became a symbol of Bush's down-to-earth demeanor, even as it baffled nutritionists and angered the produce lobby. And while broccoli was being banished from presidential aircraft, another sticky substance was about to drown Boston. Molasses, thick and deadly. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919. It sounds like a joke, like something from a cartoon or an overly enthusiastic dessert commercial. But the Great Molasses Flood of 1919 was very real, very sticky, and tragically fatal. On January 15th, in Boston's North End, a giant storage tank holding over 2.3 million gallons of molasses burst, sending a wave of syrup 25 feet high barreling through the streets at nearly 35 miles per hour. Buildings were crushed. Horses were swept away. The wave knocked over train cars, splintered timber, and trapped people in a thick, suffocating sludge. In total, 21 people were killed, and more than 150 were injured. The cleanup took weeks, and the neighborhood reportedly smelled of molasses for decades afterward. The disaster was blamed on poor maintenance and the company's rush to expand production during wartime demand. Investigations revealed that the tank was structurally unsound and had been leaking long before it finally gave way. It led to new safety regulations for industrial construction and is still studied today as one of the most bizarre urban disasters in American history. And while Boston was drowning in sugar, the economy was getting ready to melt down over something shinier: silver, and the populists who wanted it flowing freely. The free silver movement. In the closing decades of the 19th century, a fierce economic debate split the country not along north and south, but gold and silver. The free silver movement, led by populists and farmers in the West and South, demanded the unlimited coinage of silver to expand the money supply and combat economic depression. Their enemy? The gold standard, and the Eastern bankers who clung to it like a golden idol. To the free silver crowd, more money meant relief, higher crop prices, easier debt payments, and economic justice for the working man. They believed the gold standard unfairly restricted the economy and benefited industrial elites. Their battle cry, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold," made famous by William Jennings Bryan in his fiery 1896 Democratic National Convention speech. Bryan lost the presidency and the gold standard held. But the movement wasn't just about coins, it was about power. It represented the growing voice of rural America, demanding to be heard in a rapidly industrializing country. And while silver advocates dreamed of liberation through metal, the next president to emerge would be born thousands of miles away from the mainland, on an island that would become his symbol: Barack Obama. Born outside the continental U.S. in 1961, a baby named Barack Hussein Obama II was born in Honolulu, Hawaii, just 2 years after the islands became the 50th state. That birth would make him the first president in American history born outside the continental United States, a unique footnote that would become both a symbol of global inclusivity and, unfortunately, the centerpiece of a conspiracy-fueled firestorm decades later. Obama's Hawaiian birth wasn't just geographical trivia, it shaped his worldview. Raised amid a blend of American, Asian, and Polynesian cultures, his early years were steeped in diversity. Later, time spent in Indonesia further expanded his lens on the world. When he ran for president in 2008, he became not just a political phenomenon, but a generational shift. The first African-American president, and the first to truly embody America's global, multicultural, 21st-century face. Of course, his Hawaiian birth became the target of the infamous birther conspiracy, falsely claiming he wasn't born in the U.S. Despite a birth certificate, newspaper announcements, and official records, the rumor persisted, fueled by political theater and internet madness. But the fact remains, Barack Obama was born on American soil in the Pacific, thousands of miles from Washington, D.C., and still rose to lead it. Now imagine if someone tried to put all of that under a dome. Because next up, it's Manhattan, in a bubble, the domed city over Manhattan. In the 1960s, as American optimism collided with space-age ambition, one urban planning idea pushed the boundaries of reality. Put Manhattan under a dome. A real dome. Like something out of a sci-fi utopia, complete with climate control, smog filtering, and hurricane-proof protection. The idea wasn't a joke. Architects, engineers, and futurists actually drew up plans to cover a large part of New York City with a geodesic dome spanning multiple city blocks. The proposal, partly inspired by the visionary work of Buckminster Fuller, was meant to solve the city's mounting environmental problems: pollution, unpredictable weather, and urban decay. Imagine a New York where you could walk to work in January in shirt sleeves, where rain never soaked Broadway, and where air quality was perfectly engineered. That was the pitch. Of course, there were a few problems. The scale was insane. The cost, billions. Logistics, laughable. And New Yorkers, not known for wanting to live in a giant greenhouse. The dome never got past the fantasy phase, but it captured a moment in time when American cities believed they could control nature with enough steel and ingenuity. And from sci-fi domes to shadowy diplomacy, the next event involves French spies, American pride, and an alphabetical scandal, the XYZ affair. The XYZ affair, diplomacy, gone disastrously French. In 1797, relations between the United States and revolutionary France hit a wall, and then caught fire. American diplomats were sent to Paris to negotiate peace after tensions flared over trade and naval interference. But instead of a handshake, they got shakedowns. French agents, later codenamed X, Y, and Z, demanded bribes just for a meeting with the foreign minister. Their price? $250,000 up front and a sizable loan to France. The Americans were outraged. Bribery was an accepted part of European diplomacy, but the U.S. delegation wasn't having it. They left without a deal, and when President John Adams released the report to Congress, the public exploded. The phrase, "millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute," became a national rallying cry. France had insulted the young republic, and America wanted payback. What followed was an undeclared naval war known as the Quasi-War. U.S. and French ships clashed in the Caribbean. Trade routes were disrupted, and war fever ran high until cooler heads on both sides eventually reached peace in 1800. The XYZ affair solidified American distrust of European politics and proved that the U.S., while young, was not to be bullied. And from real brawls to ring bouts, the next president punched his way into history. Literally. It's Roosevelt versus blindness. Theodore Roosevelt boxes himself half blind. Theodore Roosevelt was not built for boredom. A rancher, rough rider, and reformer, he charged through life like a man trying to outpace death itself. So naturally, when he became president, he brought his fists with him, literally. Roosevelt continued boxing during his time in the White House, regularly sparring with professional fighters in makeshift rings set up inside the executive mansion. It wasn't just exercise. For Roosevelt, it was about toughness, vitality, and proving that the leader of the free world didn't sit behind a desk. He stood in the ring, but this macho tradition came to an abrupt and painful halt when a young artillery officer he was sparring with landed a brutal punch to Roosevelt's left eye. The injury wasn't immediate, but over time, it worsened. Eventually, Roosevelt lost vision in that eye completely. True to form, he never publicly complained. He quietly stopped boxing and shifted to judo instead. Because of course he did. The incident became part of Roosevelt's larger-than-life mythology. A president so vigorous, he literally fought until he couldn't see. And while he boxed his way into blindness, the Navy was busy giving killer whales a job description that sounded straight out of a spy thriller. Killer whales as torpedo retrievers. At the height of Cold War experimentation, when the line between military strategy and marine circus blurred, the U.S. Navy entertained one of its wildest ideas: training killer whales to retrieve torpedoes from the ocean floor. That's right, orca whales, apex predators, reimagined as underwater recovery agents. The idea wasn't as far-fetched as it sounds. Orcas are incredibly intelligent, trainable, and capable of deep, agile dives that put most human divers to shame. So if you lost $1 million torpedo in the murky depths, why not send in nature's most elegant torpedo to fetch it? The Navy already had a history with dolphins and sea lions performing similar tasks, locating mines, delivering tools. But orcas, that was next-level ambition. Though the training began in controlled environments, orcas proved complicated. They were massive, unpredictable, and much more interested in being apex predators than submarine assistants. Efforts were limited, and the program never advanced beyond experimental stages. Still, for a brief moment, the world stood on the brink of a new battlefield alliance, soldier and killer whale, hunting lost hardware in harmony. And while the Navy played tag with sea monsters, back on land, Americans were building entire shanty towns out of frustration, named after the very president they blamed for their misery. Hoovervilles, the architecture of desperation. The Great Depression didn't just gut the economy, it reshaped the American landscape, literally. As unemployment soared past 25% and millions lost their homes, makeshift shantytowns began sprouting up in cities across the country. These weren't just tents and tarps. They were sprawling, improvised communities made from cardboard, scrap wood, tin, and whatever else people could salvage. They were called Hoovervilles, a bitter jab at President Herbert Hoover, who many blamed for the economic collapse and the government's sluggish response. These settlements cropped up in public parks, under bridges, on riverbanks. They became bleak symbols of resilience and neglect. Families huddled in freezing shacks, cooking on open fires, trading goods, and organizing informal aid networks. Seattle's Hooverville was one of the largest housing thousands. Others dotted Central Park, the outskirts of St. Louis, and hundreds of smaller towns. Newspapers documented their growth. Social reformers used them as proof that the system had failed. Despite their tragic origins, Hoovervilles became a testament to American endurance. People built communities in the ashes of prosperity. And while these improvised cities spread across America, a single patent sat in a drawer, filed by a tall man with a stovepipe hat who saw a problem on the water and aimed to fix it. Enter Abraham Lincoln's invention, Lincoln's patent, boats, buoyancy, and brains. Long before Abraham Lincoln became a Civil War icon and the great emancipator, he was a curious, restless young congressman who saw innovation as a path to national greatness. In 1849, he did something no other U.S. president has done. He earned a patent. The invention was clever and deeply practical, a system to lift boats over shoals and other shallow water obstructions. Lincoln, having spent his youth navigating flatboats on the Mississippi, understood firsthand the frustrations of getting stuck. His design involved a set of inflatable bellows attached to the sides of a boat. When a vessel encountered a sandbar, the bellows could be filled with air to lift it temporarily, allowing it to glide over obstacles. Lincoln's patent, number 6469, was granted, and a model of the device, carved by Lincoln himself, now resides at the Smithsonian. The invention was never manufactured or used commercially, but that wasn't the point. It revealed a side of Lincoln most forget: the thinker, the tinkerer, the man who believed deeply in the power of innovation. And as Lincoln dreamt of lifting boats, future scientists would dream of teaching apes to speak, not with their mouths, but with their hands, teaching chimpanzees sign language. In the 1960s and 70s, a group of ambitious researchers attempted to bridge the species divide by teaching chimpanzees American Sign Language. The goal? to prove that non-human primates could grasp human language, not just mimicry or conditioning, but actual meaningful communication. It was part psychology, part linguistics, and part the bold hope that we weren't the only conversational creatures on the planet. The most famous of these experiments involved chimpanzees like Washoe and Nim Chimpsky, named with a wink toward famed linguist Noam Chomsky. Trainers used repetition and reward to teach signs for food, emotions, people, and objects. And it worked. Sort of. Washoe reportedly learned over 100 signs and even taught some to her adopted infant chimp. She could sign words like hug, more, and open. Nim, on the other hand, was less impressive. Learning signs, yes, but stringing them into chaotic, often nonsensical sequences like banana me, banana you, banana me. The results were wildly controversial. Were the chimps actually communicating, or just cleverly mimicking trainers to get snacks? Regardless, the experiments pushed boundaries, forcing humans to confront how we define language, intelligence, and personhood. And speaking of pushing boundaries, the Reno gang did just that. Right into a moving train, guns drawn, ready for America's first great train robbery. The Great Train Robbery of 1866. Before Jesse James, before Butch Cassidy, there was the Reno gang. Pioneers of crime who committed the first peacetime train robbery in U.S. history. On a quiet evening in 1866 near Seymour, Indiana, the Renos climbed aboard an Ohio and Mississippi railway train, cracked open a safe, and made off with over $10,000, worth several $100,000 today. They were efficient, bold, and devastatingly effective. And more importantly, they were trendsetters. The success of the heist sparked a wave of similar robberies across the Midwest, turning trains into rolling targets and gang members into folk villains. The Renos struck again and again until rail companies hired private detectives, the legendary Pinkertons, to hunt them down. Eventually, public fury boiled over. Vigilante mobs captured several gang members and, in a chilling act of frontier justice, lynched them while they awaited trial. The government tried to regain control, but the message had already been sent. Trains were no longer invincible, and America's criminal age had officially begun. It wasn't just a robbery, it was a rupture. The old rules were gone. And while the Renos stole money, one future president would steal headlines just by reading faster than most people could blink. JFK, the speed reader in chief. John F. Kennedy wasn't just young, charismatic, and movie star handsome. He also claimed to read faster than a human heartbeat. Reportedly clocking in at 1,200 words per minute, the average is around 200, 300, JFK's reading speed became a talking point for both admirers and skeptics. Speed reading courses saw a boom in popularity. If the president did it, it had to be legit. Kennedy wasn't shy about it either. He openly encouraged his staff to take speed reading classes and boasted about tearing through stacks of memos, books, and newspapers in a fraction of the time. Whether he fully absorbed every word is up for debate, but his ability to consume large volumes of material quickly was part of his intellectual image, along with his love of history, literature, and politics. Speed reading wasn't just a parlor trick. It fit the JFK brand. Sleek, efficient, forward-thinking. He embodied the future, and reading faster was just one more way to stay ahead. And while JFK was speeding through prose, the U.S. Army was freezing its ambitions under literal tons of ice. Next, a secret nuclear base buried in Greenland's frozen heart. Project Iceworm, nukes under the ice. In the late 1950s, at the height of the Cold War, the U.S. Army cooked up one of its most audacious and frostbitten plans. Build a network of nuclear missile launch sites under the Greenland ice sheet. The operation was codenamed Project Iceworm, and it sounds like something out of a Bond villain's notebook, because it nearly was. The idea was to hide hundreds of missiles beneath the ice, protected from Soviet attack and capable of striking targets across the globe. The Army began by constructing a test facility called Camp Century, complete with tunnels, dorms, kitchens, and even a working nuclear reactor to power it all. Soldiers lived beneath 30 feet of snow in an artificial ice city. An Arctic science fiction dream turned freezing reality. But Iceworm had one fatal flaw. Greenland's ice is alive. It shifts, flows, and crushes anything in its path. The tunnels twisted. The walls cracked. Engineers realized the structure couldn't survive for long, let alone support missile silos. The project was abandoned, and Camp Century was left to be buried by time and snow. But for a brief, icy moment, America nearly turned the Arctic into a launch pad for Armageddon. From buried bombs to buried ideas, the next chapter unveils a political party that tried to keep America pure by knowing absolutely nothing. The Know Nothing Party, America's first anti-immigrant movement. In the mid-1800s, America found itself awash in change. Industrialization, urban growth, and a tidal wave of immigration, especially from Ireland and Germany. Enter the Know Nothing Party, a nativist political movement that aimed to slam the gates shut. Officially called the American Party, they got their nickname from the response members gave when questioned about their activities. I know nothing. Their platform was simple and deeply exclusionary. They believed America should be ruled by native-born Protestants, not Catholic immigrants, whom they viewed as agents of foreign influence. They demanded longer naturalization periods, restrictions on non-native office holding, and limits on immigrant voting rights. They blamed newcomers for crime, poverty, and urban decay. Sound familiar? For a brief moment, they had serious momentum. In the 1850s, the Know Nothings won dozens of seats in Congress, took over several state legislatures, and even ran a former president, Millard Fillmore, for the White House. But their star burned fast and fizzled. Internal divisions, rising tensions over slavery, and their cartoonish secrecy made them easy targets. Still, the Know Nothings left a stain, the blueprint for xenophobic populism in American politics. And speaking of politics and pets, the next founding father received one donkey, not as an insult, but a royal gift. George Washington's Spanish donkey, royal gift, practical problem. George Washington had many titles: general, president, founding father. But perhaps the least known was donkey breeder. And for that, he could thank the King of Spain. In the 1780s, Washington received an unusual diplomatic gift, a prized Andalusian donkey named Royal Gift. The idea was simple: breed the donkey with American mares and create a stronger, more productive generation of mules for agriculture and transport. Back then, mules were essential for hauling heavy loads, but good breeding stock was hard to find. The Andalusian, a breed famous for its strength and stamina, was the equine equivalent of a muscle car. Washington was thrilled. He even coordinated the donkey's passage across the Atlantic and arranged for its health and quarantine upon arrival. Once settled, Royal Gift was put to work, fathering a new generation of mules on Mount Vernon and beyond. Washington's interest in breeding wasn't just a hobby. It was a testament to his obsession with progress and innovation, even in farming. It's a strange but true legacy. America's first president helping modernize its agriculture with a royal ass. And speaking of airborne oddities, next comes the U.S. military's plan to fly not just planes, but entire payloads, with the help of massive kites. Giant kites and military ambitions. At some point in American military history, someone looked at a child's toy and thought, what if we scaled that up to carry cargo? Thus began the era of military-grade kites, specifically giant airborne contraptions designed to lift surveillance equipment, emergency gear, or even small loads of supplies into the sky. These weren't flimsy beach day flyers. These were massive, engineered beasts, sometimes spanning tens of feet, built from lightweight materials and reinforced to endure harsh conditions. The most infamous of these experiments took place during both World Wars and the early Cold War, where kites were tested as alternatives to balloons and aircraft for observation and signal boosting. Some could even hoist a person off the ground, tethered, of course, turning the soldier into a reluctant airborne scout. But the vision didn't quite take off. Kites proved unstable, vulnerable to wind shifts and downright terrifying in high altitudes. Balloons and later drones quickly outclassed them. Still, for a brief, windy moment, military planners dreamed of launching equipment with strings and cloth, an idea equal parts charming and chaotic. And while kites floundered in the sky, a storm was brewing that wouldn't drift away so easily. Up next, the East Coast gets buried under the blizzard of '96. The Great East Coast Blizzard of 1996. In January 1996, Mother Nature dropped a frozen sledgehammer on the eastern United States. The Great Blizzard of Dufresne 96 wasn't just cold, it was colossal. Over the span of several days, it buried cities from Washington, D.C. to Boston under 2 to 3 feet of snow. Airports shut down. Governments closed. The I-95 corridor, home to over 50 million people, was paralyzed under a whiteout apocalypse. Philadelphia recorded its greatest snowfall ever, over 30 inches. New York City saw drifts swallow entire cars. Roofs collapsed under the weight. Ice storms followed, freezing already snowbound neighborhoods into eerie, silent cities. And just when residents thought it was over, a sudden warm-up caused catastrophic flooding as the snow melted into swollen rivers and bursting pipes. But the blizzard also revealed something unexpected: resilience. People dug out strangers. Kids turned entire streets into sledding highways. Emergency responders worked around the clock, saving lives one snow-choked block at a time. The blizzard of '96 wasn't just a weather event. It was a community-wide endurance test. And when it passed, the stories remained. Speaking of endurance, one president marched into war not behind the lines, but leading troops himself. Next, it's James Madison, commander-in-chief with boots on the ground. James Madison leads troops into battle. Of all the presidents, James Madison might be the most unexpected battlefield commander. Known for his intellect, his Federalist Papers, and his slight stature, Madison wasn't exactly built for the front lines. Yet during the War of 1812, when the British burned Washington, he became the only sitting president to personally command troops in the field. It happened during the Battle of Bladensburg in 1814. As British forces marched on the capital, Madison rode out with the militia to try to stop them. It was less Braveheart and more oh no, as the disorganized American defense collapsed in a matter of hours. Madison, in his mid-60s, was nearly captured. His wife, Dolly, famously fled the White House after saving a portrait of George Washington. Still, the moment was extraordinary. Madison, a man of ideas and debate, found himself amid cannon fire and retreating soldiers. He wasn't a warrior, but he showed up. Flawed, frantic, but present. It was a rare moment when the presidency literally saddled up. From presidential bravery to acoustic chaos, the next fact dives into a weapon designed to control crowds not with force, but with sound waves that packed a punch. The sonic cannon, turning sound into a weapon. In a world where wars were fought with bullets, bombs, and brute force, the U.S. military explored a new frontier in crowd control: sound. Not music, not speeches. Weaponized sound waves. Enter the sonic cannon, a device designed to incapacitate enemies, disrupt protests, or disperse crowds by blasting them with ultra-loud high-frequency noise. These weren't your average speakers. These machines, known as LRADs, long-range acoustic devices, could project piercing sounds over vast distances, often exceeding 150 decibels, enough to cause severe discomfort, disorientation, and even hearing loss. The pitch wasn't just loud, it was punishing. Victims would clutch their ears, flee the source, and in some cases collapse from the sheer intensity. Deployed in Iraq, used at G20 protests and mounted on naval ships, sonic cannons became the quiet yet loud darlings of non-lethal defense strategy. While marketed as humane, critics warned of their potential to cause lasting harm, especially to children, the elderly, and anyone with auditory sensitivities. It was a weapon for the modern age. No bullets, no blood, just invisible waves that could leave you screaming from the inside out. And while invisible waves rattled the eardrums, a more visible act of destruction came in 1814, when British soldiers torched the Capitol. The burning of Washington, 1814's fiery humiliation. In the War of 1812, America suffered many blows, but none burned deeper than the night the British invaded the Capitol and set it ablaze. On August 24th, 1814, British forces marched almost unopposed into Washington, D.C. They had just defeated U.S. troops at the Battle of Bladensburg and now had their sights set on symbolic domination. Their first stop? The Capitol building. It went up in flames. Then came the White House, then known as the Executive Mansion, where British officers reportedly dined on President Madison's table before torching the place. The flames lit the sky for miles. Government buildings, the Treasury, the Library of Congress, all reduced to smoldering ruins. This wasn't just destruction, it was humiliation. The young republic had been caught with its pants down, and its enemies rubbed salt in the wound by turning the president's dinner into a pre-burned buffet. But amid the ashes, national resolve hardened. The attack galvanized American resistance. Within months, the British were repelled, and Washington began to rebuild, brick by stubborn brick. And speaking of brains behind the rebuild, the next president wasn't just a politician. He was the only one with a Ph.D. Meet Professor Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, the professor-in-chief. Most presidents have law degrees, military experience, or simply the gift of the gab. But only one brought a professor's brain to the Oval Office. Woodrow Wilson, the only U.S. president to hold a Ph.D. He earned his doctorate in political science from Johns Hopkins University, long before political science was even widely recognized as a serious field. Before stepping into the world of politics, Wilson spent years in academia. He taught at Princeton University, later became its president, and was known for his dense lectures, deep thoughts, and obsession with governmental efficiency. He wasn't your backslapping, glad-handing type. He was a man who believed in systems, principles, and a very precise way of running things. As president, Wilson's academic rigor showed. He crafted the Federal Reserve System, signed the Clayton Antitrust Act, and led the U.S. into World War I with moral clarity, branding it a war to make the world safe for democracy. His idealism also birthed the League of Nations, though the U.S. would famously refuse to join. Wilson wasn't always beloved, but he was unmistakably cerebral. And while he shaped history with intellect, another era dreamed of shaping it with raw power. Lightning in a gun barrel. Up next, America's 1930s obsession with death rays. The death ray craze of the 1930s. Before lasers were real, before Star Wars made pew-pew fashionable, America flirted with the idea of a death ray, a weapon of pure energy that could vaporize enemies, destroy aircraft mid-air, and defend entire coastlines without ever firing a bullet. It sounds like a comic book fantasy. But in the 1930s, inventors, military officials, and even respected scientists genuinely believed that a beam of concentrated energy could change warfare forever. The idea had many incarnations. Some claimed they could use focused radio waves, others high-voltage electricity. Still others proposed mysterious electromagnetic force fields. One of the most famous figures to dabble in death ray lore was Nikola Tesla, who allegedly pitched his version of the weapon to governments around the world, calling it a teleforce beam capable of destroying entire armies. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, none of these prototypes worked. They either didn't generate enough energy, couldn't maintain focus over distance, or just flat out didn't do anything. But the myth endured, fueled by pulp fiction and public fascination with invisible power. And while America's enemies weren't fried by rays, its own officials were cooked by scandal. Because next up is the whiskey ring, where tax dollars evaporated into bourbon and bribery. The whiskey ring scandal, bourbon, bribes, and betrayal. It's the 1870s. Ulysses S. Grant is president. The Civil War is a scar still healing, and whiskey is flowing freely, sometimes too freely. Enter the whiskey ring, one of the largest corruption scandals in U.S. history. The plot was simple. Distillers, government agents, and politicians colluded to avoid paying excise taxes on liquor. In return, they funneled the uncollected money into private pockets and sometimes into Republican campaign funds. How did it work? Government officials underreported the actual quantity of whiskey being produced. Distillers paid a bribe instead of a tax. Everyone got rich, except, of course, the U.S. Treasury. At its peak, the ring siphoned off millions of dollars, and the scandal went all the way to the top. President Grant's personal secretary, Orville Babcock, was indicted, though later acquitted. Grant himself was never implicated directly, but the affair badly tarnished his administration's already shaky reputation for corruption. The whiskey ring wasn't just a story of greed. It was a cautionary tale about power, secrecy, and what happens when the government becomes too cozy with the industries it's supposed to regulate. And while politicians drowned in bourbon and scandal, one founding father was just vibing with a bird who had the run of the White House. Meet Jefferson's Mockingbird. Jefferson's Mockingbird, the first free bird in residence. Thomas Jefferson, third president of the United States and part-time Enlightenment superhero, had a soft spot for music and birds, which led to one of the quirkiest footnotes in White House history, his pet mockingbird, named Dick. But this wasn't just a cage-bound songbird. Jefferson let him roam freely through the executive mansion, giving the term free bird a whole new meaning. Dick wasn't just a pet. He was a companion. He perched on Jefferson's shoulder while he worked, flitted about during meetings, and reportedly loved to sing along while Jefferson played the violin. The bird learned to mimic not only other birds, but human whistles and even bits of music. Visitors were often startled to hear concertos echoing through the halls until they realized the source was feathered and perched on a window ledge. Jefferson kept several birds over the years, but Dick was the standout. His presence softened the image of a president often seen as austere and cerebral. It was one more way Jefferson blended intellect with nature, policy with poetry. And while Jefferson's bird sang in the corridors of power, the next idea dreamed of stretching across an abyss, literally. Get ready for the sky bridge across the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon sky bridge that almost was. When it comes to building big, America never lacks vision. And in the mid-20th century, that vision nearly included a massive, mind-bending bridge stretching across one of nature's most sacred scars, the Grand Canyon. The idea? Build a sky bridge. Not just any bridge, but a monumental structure connecting the rim to the rim, offering travelers a shortcut and tourists a thrill ride through the heavens. Proposals varied. Some designs included suspension bridges, others cable cars or elevated highways. Engineers envisioned panoramic observation decks, restaurants suspended above the abyss, and glass-bottomed walkways that let you look straight down into the Earth's gaping maw. The selling point was clear. America would conquer not just space, but also its own terrain, turning a natural wonder into a futuristic corridor. But the plan hit resistance. Environmentalists, indigenous tribes, and geologists pushed back hard. The Grand Canyon wasn't just rock, it was heritage, sacred land, a fragile ecosystem. Building a megabridge wasn't just impractical, it was offensive. Eventually, the concept was scrapped, or at least delayed, until the 21st century iteration, the Grand Canyon Skywalk, a much smaller glass horseshoe. Still dramatic, but not a literal rim-to-rim ribbon in the sky. And as tourists dreamed of walking the skies, another wave of dreamers was digging for gold. Time to rewind to the original stampede. California, 1849. The California Gold Rush, riches, ruin, and a new state. In 1848, James W. Marshall found gold at Sutter's Mill. By 1849, the world knew. What followed was a human tidal wave. Nearly 300,000 people surged into California from every continent, all lured by the same glittering promise, wealth beyond imagination. They were dubbed 49ers, and they transformed a quiet western territory into a booming, chaotic, often lawless, gold-slicked metropolis. Some came by wagon. Others sailed around Cape Horn or crossed the deadly Isthmus of Panama. They faced disease, starvation, robbery, and heartbreak. Few struck it rich. Most ended up broke, broken, or buried. Still, the rush rewired American ambition. San Francisco exploded from a village into a metropolis. California leapfrogged to statehood by 1850, bypassing territorial status entirely. But the gold came at a steep cost. Native American tribes were decimated by disease, violence, and displacement. The environment was ravaged by hydraulic mining and river dredging. It was the American dream dipped in mercury and mud. Still, the legacy was pure alchemy. Dirt into dreams, dreams into cities. And while gold fever melted minds, one president stayed grounded, thanks to a goat who roamed the White House lawn like he owned it. Andrew Johnson's presidential goat. Most presidents have dogs. A few had exotic pets, like eagles, raccoons, or even alligators. But Andrew Johnson, 17th President of the United States, had something else entirely. A goat. And not just a goat tucked away in the stables. This one roamed the White House lawn like it was his personal kingdom. After inheriting the presidency from the assassinated Abraham Lincoln, Johnson was already walking a tightrope. The country was fractured. Reconstruction was tense. Johnson himself was embattled and unpopular. So maybe it makes sense that amid the chaos, he found comfort in the most stubborn creature alive. Goats don't care about politics. Reports say Johnson's goat, along with its kid, would trot freely through the executive mansion grounds, delighting his grandchildren and amusing staffers. It wasn't just a mascot. It was a tiny act of rebellion against presidential decorum. Some historians speculate that Johnson's goat-keeping reflected his earthy, working-class sensibility. Others think he just liked goats. Either way, it's a reminder that even presidents, especially the controversial ones, sometimes just want to hang out with their pet barnyard animal. And while Johnson was embracing livestock, scientists were giving pigeons jobs. Important ones. Strap in for the most feathery missile guidance system ever attempted. Project Pigeon. Feathers and firepower. It sounds like a joke, or maybe a Pixar short gone rogue, but during World War II, the U.S. military genuinely explored a plan to use pigeons to guide missiles. This wasn't a metaphor. It was a top-secret operation called Project Pigeon, dreamed up by behaviorist psychologist B.F. Skinner. Yes, the same Skinner who trained rats with food pellets and redefined how we understand behavior. Here was the concept. Pigeons, trained to peck at images of enemy targets on a screen, would sit inside the nose cone of a guided missile. As the bird pecked, the missile's flight path would adjust accordingly, steering it toward the desired target. It was early biometric tech, powered not by silicon, but by seed-motivated bird brains. And it actually worked, at least in lab conditions. Pigeons proved shockingly accurate. But the military brass didn't have the stomach to invest fully in a weapon that relied on poultry. Eventually, the project was shelved in favor of electronic guidance systems, but Skinner never stopped defending it. Pigeons are ideal, he insisted. They don't panic, they don't chatter, they just do the job. And from trained birds to rebel cattle, our next stop is a Revolutionary War conflict you've probably never heard of, the Battle of the Cowsheds. The Battle of the Cowsheds. Revolutionary bovine warfare. Before America had tanks, it had cows. And during the early days of the Revolutionary War in 1775, a bizarre skirmish unfolded in Massachusetts that historians have nicknamed the Battle of the Cowsheds. While it doesn't get its own monument, this strange episode offers a glimpse into the war's scrappy, grassroots reality, where livestock was a strategic resource and cattle rustling became an act of rebellion. The context: British troops and loyalists were stationed in Boston, heavily reliant on surrounding farms for food. Patriot militiamen, understanding the strategic value of beef, began raiding pastures to deny supplies to the redcoats. What followed was a series of quick, often chaotic confrontations, where armed colonists attempted to liberate cattle herds from loyalist farms. These weren't glorious battlefield clashes. They were tense, muddy, and sometimes absurd. Guys with muskets yelling over mooing herds, chasing after runaways, dodging British patrols. Yet the outcome mattered. By cutting off the British meat supply, patriots applied economic pressure the old-fashioned way, through stolen cows and scorched barns. The cowsheds clash became symbolic of the revolution's DIY nature, improvised, tactical, and sometimes more barnyard than battlefield. And speaking of building things from the ground up, the final tale returns us to America's beginning, when whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was part of the payroll. Whiskey wages at the White House construction site. When the White House was being built in the 1790s, America was still a nation in its teenage years, scrappy, overworked, and always a little thirsty. The laborers hired to construct the president's new mansion in Washington, D.C., were mostly Irish and Scottish immigrants, many of whom brought with them a strong cultural tradition, being paid, in part, in liquor. That's right. Whiskey wasn't just a luxury. It was compensation. Along with daily wages, laborers often received rations of whiskey to get them through long hours of grueling, dangerous work. And back then, this wasn't seen as unusual. Alcohol was considered safer than water in many places, and it was also a morale booster, liquid encouragement for stonecutters, carpenters, and masons, laying the literal foundation of American power. The practice was so normalized that records even detailed how much was allocated. No secret deals here. Booze was as much a line item as bricks and nails. It was the original version of a job with benefits. And so, as the seat of American democracy rose stone by stone, it did so on the backs and the buzz of a workforce fueled not just by ambition, but by whiskey. Cheers to that.